Welcome everybody, and if I can call the public board meeting of NHS England to action. Welcome. We've got apologies for absence today from Jeremy Townsend and Steve. Well, you see, Steve, I know you've got to leave in about just after 5 o'clock, I think, but thank you for being here. Can I just see if there are any additional declarations of interest that people have since we last met? Mary?
I've been appointed to the Special Inquiry into Preterm Birth.
Thank you. So we'll note that in your declarations. Thank you very much. Is the board happy to support and so I can sign off the minutes of the meeting of 7th of December?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So let me just give a few introductory remarks, and I'll try and be brief because actually we've got quite a packed agenda today, and I think each of these topics are important to deserve some real focus and discussion. One of the topics I'm really looking forward to, because we did this at the Digital Data and Technology Committee, which of course actually has taken over the oversight challenge that the NHS Digital Board used to exercise. But actually we had a very good presentation, and where's Joe in the room here? There, got you. So we've got Joe and Helen here, Helen Clifton and Joe Harrison, and there is a presentation later on the NHS app. And I highlight that in particular because I think it is transformational and revolutionary, actually, in terms of the way the NHS operates, and it has huge further potential. You'll know the numbers better than me, but it's sort of 33 million or so of the population, 74% of the population, or numbers like that, now have the app, and clearly the interaction with the citizens through the app into health. I think it's a brilliant new platform. So we had a very good private board meeting, I think, and a series of, again, very good and really meaty topics. We looked, as the board knows, at long-term infrastructure strategy, long-term capital strategy. Very sensible to look long-term, as we did with the long-term workforce plan. And within that long-term infrastructure review, we also looked within that as one of the components, which is the new hospitals programme, and had a very good update on that. And again, staying on long-term looks forward. Again, Navina, you gave us a very good update on continued implementation progress with the long-term workforce plan. Again, we had a bit of a think about primary care, just looking at the way primary care is operating and potential future roles and ways of operating for primary care. And then we had a very good conversation, Amanda Doyle, led by you again, on dentistry and reform and recovery of dentistry. So some very good and meaty topics there. Let me just then make some other comments. I don't want to take Amanda Pritchard's thunder and for the team, but I would quickly like to comment on winter, and just to say that the performance this winter, and it's not over yet, was so markedly better than last winter. But in saying that, we're not at all complacent. There's still much further to go. But actually, as we now enter February, actually the performance in winter, and we'll have an update on it later on, I think is a credit to the huge hard work of the workforce, and actually the fact that early planning was put in place and very targeted interventions were put in place, and collaboration across ICBs and systems into providers and into primary operated really well. So there's still much further to go, but actually the performance this current winter, on average, sort of roughly twice a better performance than we saw in the previous year. I'd quite like to just make, if I can, an announcement. It was actually announced slightly early today, and the board probably haven't had a chance yet to pick it up. But today we launched the National BRCA Gene Testing Programme, which identifies cancer risk early. And there are tens of thousands of people with Jewish ancestry who are more likely to carry this genetic fault that can increase the risk of developing certain cancers. And they actually are going to receive genetic testing under this new programme. We have plans to identify thousands more people who carry faults in the BRCA genes over the next 2 years. so that they can seek early access to surveillance and monitoring and prevention services. And that testing programme is part of the NHS's major drive to catch tumours early when they are much easier to treat. And there's an announcement I think has gone out earlier today, but I did want to just make that announcement here on the public board. In terms of other topics, I attended yesterday, and I referenced an earlier conversation we had in the private board session on primary care. I had the great pleasure yesterday of attending an all-day session with a significant number of GP leaders, and it's the first GP leadership event hosted by the NHS, and it was hosted in person by Claire Fuller and Amanda Doyle and Navina Evans. It really was a very good engagement, and we did 4 breakouts in the day, and everyone engaged on each of those. But it won't surprise you that they are estates, which is quite, I often describe as a sort of Gordian knot issue within primary care. We looked at primary-secondary interface, how that operates, how we might be able to think about its improvement. We absolutely looked at GP retention, which is clearly a very important conversation, and to have that discussion with the leadership in the room, the quality of the leadership in the room was excellent. And then we also looked at patient safety in primary care. It's the first event of its type for that GP cohort. We're going to hold that a couple of times, 2 or 3 times a year. We'll probably also look to do that again in pharmacy and also in dentistry. But going back to the GP cohort, the thing I would be most excited about is then getting that GP voice into the gatherings, into the seminars and meetings when we bring together providers or other groups across the NHS. Now, I know this happens in the systems in the ICBs. That's very good. It also helps, I think, to get that community of voices getting after particular issues together. I'll only reference 2 or 3 meetings that I've had. I visited Guy's and St Thomas's, actually with the Deputy PM in mid-January, and we were looking at their genomics and biosecurity activities. Vin, you were with me. It was a really interesting and high-quality visit. It helped me because on the 29th of January, I attended my first Genomics England board, where I've joined that board. And again, think about whole genome sequencing, the leadership we have internationally or globally in whole genome. Actually, it's really good, and I'm delighted that I've joined that board. I also had made the point that whilst that's really important and we must drive and support it as hard as we can, we sometimes forget that actually the whole genome sequencing work is less than 10% of the genomics activity that's carried out across the whole of the NHS. And so actually thinking about going back to the NHS app, actually, the levels of innovation, transformation, we see it in the app. We also see it in actually genomics and in our NHS England genomics activities. We now, I think last year, Amanda, we did I think we tested over 700,000 patients. For the minute, someone should probably square bracket that number and check it, but I think we tested over 700,000 patients, and we're scanning, and we scan for 200 cancers and over 3,000 rare diseases is my memory of it. So it's a remarkable transformation in the offer of the NHS of services to the population. Coming up on the 28th of February, we've got an event in person of ICB and Trust chairs. Again, it's really good to bring those two communities together. They work closer together in their systems, but actually bring them all together with NHS England, I think, is important. And then lastly, we're doing some work and looking at the Leadership Academy. We're just looking at actually current offering, how it engages with particular cohorts or echelons of NHS staff, NHS managers and so on. So we're just doing a refresh on the Leadership Academy. I think that's really good. I had the pleasure of a meeting with Henrietta Hughes, the Patient Safety Commissioner. Very good engagement. She's a huge advocate, clearly, for patient safety, and we had a very good exchange. And also, Amanda, you and I met with Sir John Simons and Sir John Bell, which was really good because they'd written a good, punchy letter on Office of Life Sciences strategy looking forward. And so we had a very good engagement with them around that strategy. So I'll pause if anyone wants to ask me any questions, but I'm not trying to encourage that on my report. But if you'd like to, as always, please do. But let me hand over to Amanda for the CEO report.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Richard. So I've just got a number of things to cover because, as ever, there's a lot going on. Just to start with a word, if I may, on industrial action, because, of course, we knew that the industrial action plan on either side of Christmas and New Year was going to be tough, particularly coinciding with that early January period where there's often an increase in demand and pressure on the NHS. So I really do want to start by thanking colleagues in EPR teams up and down the country, including NHS England, and colleagues across the NHS who really did pull out all the stops to try and maintain services and safety. As we know, though, protecting urgent emergency care services does come at the expense of planned care, particularly at that time of the year. And since strikes began, the cumulative total of appointments that have been rescheduled is now over 1.3 million. As ever, that is 1.3 million people who have had to have their care rescheduled, and an awful lot of work that goes on in the background to make sure that those appointments are rebooked. So whilst I think we would recognise that the omens don't look good, we would all hope, I think, that further action can be avoided. I know we're going to come on to talk about winter in detail in a moment, but worth saying, exactly as you've just said, Richard, that despite the massive disruption that industrial action has caused, the work that we have been doing and that teams across the country have been doing this year as part of delivering the Urgent Emergency Care Recovery Plan really has made a difference. So we have achieved good progress on all of the major deliverables, including reaching the milestone of having 5,000 more core beds open, and that again we can see has made a real difference at this point of peak pressure in helping maintain flow through the system. In A&E, 1.5 million more people were seen, treated and either discharged, transferred or admitted within 4 hours in 2023 than in 2022, and 4-hour performance has been better in every month of the year that's just finished, the calendar year that's just finished, than in the previous year. The same is true for Category 1 and Category 2 ambulance calls, with Category 2 response times in December 50% lower than in December 2022, and that is despite an 11% increase in incidents. To your point, though, Richard, and it's really important that we say this, whilst I think we can take real encouragement from some of those statistics, and that is no doubt better for patients, there is still a long way to go. Yeah. And I think the other thing that we would really acknowledge is the pressure on our staff, which people are feeling up and down the country. And when I talk about urgent emergency care, I always mean mental health as well as physical health, but I think it's worth making that point explicitly because we do know that the pressures in inpatient mental health services and through our urgent emergency care services are equally acute across mental health and physical health care settings. So a huge thank you to all of the staff in the NHS who, again, are working under enormous pressure to do the best they possibly can for patients as ever. Pharmacy First, so just on another really important announcement that we've just made, the launch of Pharmacy First was something that we talked about back when the Urgent Emergency Care Recovery Plan was published a year ago. Is now come into being, which means that as of yesterday, you can walk into a high street pharmacy to get treatment and prescription medicines, or medicines that you would otherwise normally need to see a GP for in order to get a prescription for. So you can get those medicines directly walking into a high street pharmacy. And over 10,000 pharmacies in the country, that's more than 9 in 10 pharmacies that have signed up to the scheme. And what we hope is that will both take some pressure off GPs and off GP teams, but also just provide other options for patients that are more convenient for some people, because 8 in 10 people live within 20 minutes of a high street pharmacy, and opening hours are often up till midnight and certainly weekends as well. So it's an important step in what has been a continued series of investments and developments in community services. So the expansion of blood pressure checks, the expansion of oral contraceptive services, in community pharmacy, and we're looking forward to continuing to do more of that as time goes on, both in pharmacy but also community services more generally. So really wanted to just draw the board's attention to that. I suspect they did notice it yesterday. Just a few more things from me. Less positively, it is just worth the board being aware that since we last met, a significant development has been the measles outbreak, which has been declared in the West Midlands, with Birmingham in particular affected. Steve may well want to say more about this, but Steve and his team have been working really hard to support the UXA-led response, including standing up a recall campaign with millions of letters inviting parents to catch up on their child's jabs, but also lots of support for local initiatives to make sure that getting those catch-up jabs is as convenient and easy as possible for parents. Other things of note, so we've continued to make progress on delivering the long-term workforce plan. A couple of weeks ago, we launched the Emeritus scheme for retired consultants to return to the NHS to help deliver elective appointments, and that includes remote appointments, so again trying to make work flexible and keep people who want to continue to offer their expertise to the NHS to keep them working with us, but in ways that work for them as well. We've also continued to grow the workforce with a record number of nurses and midwives and health visitors in post in November. That's an increase of over 20,000 in a year. So huge congratulations to Ruth and her team, who've worked very hard to support staff both entering the profession and staying in it. We also saw, and again, I know Emily will talk about this more, but wanted to draw the board's attention to the fact that we also saw the elective waiting list fall for the second month in a row in November, thanks particularly to a break in industrial action over the autumn, as well as those continued actions that colleagues are taking across the health service, with everything from the increase in robotic surgery to thinking really creatively about things like high impact theatre lists and other innovations to make sure that patients can be seen as quickly as possible. So again, lots more to do, but a real sense of, I think, encouragement that the actions that colleagues are taking are making a difference. A couple more things before I finish, Richard. I know we're going to talk about mental health later, and Claire and Liz are here to lead us in that discussion, but just wanted to note the importance of that conversation. And it would be important anyway, but particularly in light of the tragic events in Nottingham and also the report into the really shocking behaviour and practice that we saw at the Edenfield Centre last year. That report's just come out. I think it really does just sharpen the mind and sharpen the focus on why, in all the conversation that we've had and will continue to have about access, about funding, about prevention, about all of the things that we know matter, actually just reminding us all that quality is the thing that we also are here to make sure that we are supporting people to deliver the highest quality of care, experience and safety. It is just as vital as all of the other things that we've mentioned. So making sure that when people need the support and help of health services, they get that in a way that is patient-focused, respectful, as close to home as possible, that involves the family in an appropriate way. And I know the team feel incredibly passionate about that, and we'll talk about that a bit later. Finally, just on our own organisation, so we did achieve our aim of 95% of staff within NHS England having surety of their roles in the new organisation by December. That was an important commitment we made to our own staff, and there is now a programme of work going on to ensure that this final stage of restructure, stage 3, takes place again. And Steve might want to say more about that. My thanks, as ever, not just to my executive colleagues for their continued leadership through what has been an incredibly challenging and disruptive period for the organisation, but for all of our colleagues in NHS England who have had to live through a year or more now of really just a really challenging period in terms of just personal futures and their place in our organisation, and have continued to give 100% focus to their roles to supporting the NHS and the professionalism with which colleagues have conducted themselves, I think, never ceases to impress me. So there is now a programme of work going on to harmonise policies across the 3 organisations, and in light of that, we have now communicated the decision taken on hybrid working. So we're developing resources to support individuals, line managers and teams to discuss how they will implement hybrid working in their teams. And I think we recognise that whilst there clearly are positives to remote working, there are also positives to in-person working, and the balance we have struck is, we think, the right one.
Amanda, thank you. I'm going to open up to see if there are any comments or questions to Amanda on anything she has just commented upon. I did forget just to mention a couple of other things, if I might just reverse back into a Chair's update. And the first, actually, we had a conversation this morning, and Wal's certainly doing quite a lot of work and thinking in this space. A number of us also with Wal are trying to do the same thing, which actually is about how do we grow and deepen the pipeline of candidates for roles as non-executives or chairs on our trusts and on our trust, foundation trusts and so forth. We have a very high demand for truly able chairs and non-executive directors, and I think we need to reinvigorate that pipeline and see if we can get more people to come forward and take on what are really very demanding, enjoyable at times, but also very demanding roles. The second thing I should have said, and I was trying to look behind me as Amanda was talking to see if there were any pictures of Norwich. Actually, what I should have said, of course, actually, is clearly we're here holding our board meeting in Norwich. So as guests, actually, of Norfolk and Waveney ICB, and clearly we're joined by Nick Hume and Tracy Bleakley, who will be commenting later on, I think, in the performance update on winter and our delivery there. But so we're in Norwich as part of a programme where the board does not just meet in London, which would be wholly inappropriate, but actually we do hold board meetings elsewhere around the country. So today we are in Norwich. Any comments to Amanda on anything she said? Any questions? Should we get into the agenda? I think we're heading for the agenda. Okay, very good. Emily, I think we want operational performance update. Remember, of course, that there's a separate item on winter planning and delivery, but operational update would be really helpful.
I'll do my best. So thank you to Amanda for having given some of these headlines already. So I will try and give the appropriate angle on them for the report. So, as always, the board paper presents the NHS's performance in November and December because of the timing of publication of data. So be aware of that compared to other statistics that are out there. Our position would be that the pressure has remained high on urgent and emergency care services over the winter, and it's been exacerbated by the combination of not only usual winter pressures, but also 3 days of junior doctors' industrial action in December. And obviously there was more in January, which we can look at the following board. December in particular was a challenging month for UEC, and we saw rising demand with 5.7% more emergency admissions compared to the same time last year. And I thought it was helpful to give some initial dimensions which are in the board paper. So it gives you the headline that ambulances answered 889,389,999 calls during December. And if you work it out, that averages out at just under 20 calls a minute. And by the same calculation, they're on average 8.5 ambulance arrivals at A&E every minute similarly. So you get a sense of just that ongoing volume of activity. Despite this, we had 4-hour performance at 69.4% and category 2 performance, as Amanda and Rich I think have both mentioned, at 45 minutes 57 seconds, which are both substantively better than December 22, where A&E performance was 65.2% and category 2 was 1 hour 32 minutes. So this is thanks to actions the system has taken from the UEC recovery plan, coupled with significant preparation and management for industrial action from colleagues in systems and the whole healthcare system across the country. Despite the continued challenges of IA, we have made substantive progress on some of our other targets, particularly those to reduce long waits. So, for example, the overall waiting list has decreased in October and November. So it reduced by 63,000 between September and October and by 95,600 between October 23 and November. And the total list stood at 7.6 million in November. 104-week weights increased marginally, while 78 weeks did increase by 662, which is a level that we are concerned about and taking action on. Whereas 65-week weights decreased significantly by 12,870. We also saw increased activity in other areas, not just in UEC. So on cancer, urgent suspected cancer referrals first seen are almost 128% above pre-pandemic levels. And it's helpful sometimes to look behind the data. So I thought the board might want to note that in the 2 days following the Duchess of York's announcement that she's been diagnosed with malignant melanoma, we saw more than 8 times the number of visits to the melanoma skin information page on the NHS website compared to the previous week. So obviously specifically on this one, but more broadly, we are all very aware that diagnosing cancer early saves lives. So we would always prefer that if anyone is worried about their symptoms, that they do present sooner rather than later. So that we can take the right diagnostic action. On diagnostics more broadly, our published statistics show we're delivering record diagnostic activity, 115% above pre-pandemic levels, and each month in 23-24 has seen higher activity than the same month in any previous year. So overall, we would say the service has been coping well despite winter pressures and IA, but recent weeks' data show the strain the service is under. So if we look at how stretched capacity is, our latest weekly winter data shows there was an average of 2,226 patients with flu in hospital every day last week, which is up 70% in a month and 3/4 higher than the same week last January. A significant amount of work was done, as we've discussed previously at the board, to ensure the NHS was in the best possible shape for the winter period this year, following the UEC plan, which was published a year and 2 days ago today. This included making sure capacity plans to achieve our national commitments for 5,000 additional core beds and 10,000 new virtual ward beds were delivered, which they have been. The investment on capital schemes has helped substantially this year, which includes the work on core beds and our ability to deliver the 10,000 virtual ward bed target ahead of time. We had 11,700 virtual ward beds open in December, which is tremendous progress. As we've mentioned, we'll look in more detail about what that means going forward in another board item. But I think what we have is a whole system that is pulled together with brilliant engagement and direction from top to bottom of the system, and brilliant leadership from Sarah Jane and her team, particularly being able now to see and use the same metrics from end to end of the process has made a massive difference in our ability to work together to solve problems rapidly when they arise. We also now know a lot about the impact of the interventions that we put into the system this time last year. I wanted to also bring up the point that Amanda has mentioned, but it deserves repeating, which is the extraordinary work that it took staff to respond to IA. So when we write out from NHS England about preparation for strikes, we ask that systems trusts spend at least 14 days before a strike are starting their preparation work. And we really can't underestimate how much management time and attention it takes to work through strikes effectively, as well as the disruption post-strike and the way that staff need time to recover both physical and mental health. And we're really conscious of the work that's had to go into that, particularly over the last 2 weeks after the longest ongoing period of strike action that we've previously seen between December and January. We therefore have to think about what the potential impact of future action will be, and making sure we work with systems to prepare for that, but also the impact that might have on our planned performance, and making sure we work with systems to identify how we can best mitigate that, because what we want to do is to keep on improving performance, bearing in mind everything that we've achieved collectively and everything that we've learnt over the last year. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that summary. Any comment? Yeah, well, you want to, and Mark, so, yeah.
Thanks, Emily. And I'm taking Richard's and Amanda's comments about the ambition still to do more, even though it seems to have gone okay, despite the IA. You mentioned the UEC plan, which was published a year ago, almost to the day, yeah. And presumably that was quite helpful in the performance there and subsequent follow through. What lessons from the period, I know we're still in it, so it's not finished, do we think we're going to carry through? So again, we can sort of build the base to again make sure this winter is similarly under control, in quotes.
So I wonder if we want to touch on that now or save it for the
Well, I think we
later
can.
item.
So why don't we actually? Yeah, it's a really good. Actually, it's the fundamental question, I think. So should we? Let's hold it, and we'll hold it till Sarah Jane, you and Nick and Tracy come in with Emily on the on winter planning. But I think it's the fundamental question, Mark.
Emily, you mentioned in the report the outbreaks of measles.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering what the impact on paediatric beds is.
Yeah.
And also the question about the distribution of vaccines. We had a very nasty pandemic affecting older people. This is a nasty disease that affects young people who haven't been vaccinated.
So I'll pick up quickly the bed question, but turn to Steve, who's leading the work on the rollout of further vaccination. But the occupancy of paediatric intensive care beds is, as you know, always tight during the winter. It has fluctuated up and down, but we haven't at the moment been in a position where that's been closer to the edge than we would have been anyway. But obviously the critical thing is to keep children from getting measles in the first place and from becoming that seriously ill, which is the work that Steve and his team have been doing.
Thanks, Emily. So just, Mark, to just add to the response point that you raised there. So starting next week and then running over about a 3-week period, we'll be inviting all children through their parents who are 6 to 11 years old to come forward for a vaccine, measles MMR vaccine, and in 3 areas in England where there are more concentration of cases, so London, the Midlands and Manchester, that will be extended up to 25-year-olds. So it's about 4 million people who will be invited over that period of time. And to your question on supply, we're aware that there's sufficient supply to manage that scale of vaccination.
Mary?
I just wanted to pick up the issue that you illustrated diagnostically with people concerned about malignant melanoma. Presumably the fast-track diagnosis also gives reassurance to a high proportion, and therefore they come off the waiting list quite quickly.
Yeah. Yes, that's exactly right. But so the additional capacity has been helpful at that, but with the increased demand, we really need to mesh the two together. What we've seen is as we've provided substantially more access to diagnostics in the emergency room, clinicians are now using more diagnostic work there rather than admitting people or putting them on a separate outpatient diagnostic pathway. So we've sort of moved capacity between different parts of the system. But yes, you're right. Our goal is to make sure people get that reassurance sooner rather than later.
I mean, I think we do risk sort of confettiing lots of stats around, but I like stats actually. And when you look at this, when you look at the deck, I do think the challenges are huge. The workforce's engagement with the challenges is really impressive and remarkable. But actually what comes through the papers is this more than steady increase in the demand that's coming at the NHS. So I was just looking at, there's a very interesting chart, difficult for people watching the world. We look at the mental health presentations, so number of 0 to 17-year-olds, so young people receiving a first contact with mental health services. You look at the rate of growth, and it's up virtually 50% in 4 years. And, it's over 750,000 young people now receiving that first intervention. It was a touch over 500,000 4 years ago. So that rate of demand that's coming at us, I think, and how we have to deal with it. And I think we deal with it, and clearly we do deal with that. We do deal with it. And then you look at, is it numbers of people? So I was struck again, look at the number of patients starting treatment in November of last year. It was up almost 5% on October of last year. And actually, if you look at the number of people starting treatment in a year, it's over 1.6 million people. Population of England's 57 million. So it's 1.6 million are starting treatment in November of last year, and that's more than 10% greater than it was pre-pandemic. So there's more and more interventions of treatment being provided as we meet the demand coming from the population. And I often think that scale of provision and the growth in demand is sometimes missed in the narrative and the external narrative, which isn't to say ever that we can, and we can't be complacent. There's still much more to do, and demand continues to rise. But the challenges are noteworthy, really, I think. Any other comments before we bring in, sorry, Andrew, before we bring in Julian on finance?
Thanks, Richard. Can I just bring up a point on cancer?
Yes.
So the referrals are up by a significant number, 126%, and we've still got this backlog of patients that are waiting more than 62 days. So just looking forward, as some of that additional work that we've seen starts to come through, it's going to put further pressure on us. And I'm just thinking, what can we do to get that back under control? Because all the clinical evidence is that your outcome improves if you're seen within the 62-day pathway. So that's an issue for us going forward, I think, that we need to address.
Yeah. So, I mean, we are very focused on our public targets on cancer, which we think start to tackle that challenge. Obviously, there's a longer term capacity point, to your point, Andrew, and the opportunities with new technologies to improve treatment as well. But at the moment, the 62-day backlog and the faster diagnostic standard are our focus to make sure we're doing everything we can to get those waiting down, to give early reassurance to people who are waiting without an answer, but their answer will be that they don't have cancer, and that we can then focus the treatment on the patients who need it. But as you say, as with everything else, we have a growth in demand that we need to keep on innovating, keep on improving pathways and improving capacity in order to deal with it.
And we're searching and screening much more, aren't we? I think we'll take lung trucks, which is a really good initiative. And actually, we've also dropped the age range, lowered the age range at which bowel screening, I think, is now done. So I think we're continuously looking to increase our screening capability.
To increase screening capability, and also where the lung trucks is the brilliant example, make sure we improve the quality of access. So on lung cancer, it is now more likely to be diagnosed with lung cancer early if you are in a lower decile of deprivation than if you are at the privileged end, because of where we've put the lung trunks and who they've managed to reach out to.
Very good. Thank you. Julian, financial update?
So it's very much steady as she goes compared to the report that I gave last month. We have been through the process, as we discussed previously, through November of having put funding in to cover the cost of industrial action, to agree with system by system, provider by provider, where we would outturn for the end of the year. Clearly, the background remains that inflation this year much higher than the forecast at the time we agreed the funding with government at Autumn Statement 22. I mean, roughly it is on a GDP deflator basis almost 4% higher. In terms of the way we actually experience it in health, it's probably more like 5 and 6% higher. As I've discussed previously, we see that in particular in, for example, the cost of continuing healthcare, the cost of medicines, all of which are up on average around 8 to 9% over the course of this year. And you will see that also as people have renewed energy contracts, I mean, the vast array of services that people are having to buy. The net result of all of that is that we are forecasting with systems and providers that we will end up about £1 billion off plan by the end of the year. But in aggregate, we will live within the NHS mandate as provided to us by government. Clearly, there are still ongoing discussions with the government and with the department about total final funding for the Department of Health, as will then be reflected through the supplementary estimate process. But we will live within the NHS England mandate as given to us. And conversations remain ongoing about 24-25, and with the funding that has been provided, what the expectations are for what we will deliver. I wrote out to the NHS with some guidelines, therefore, for how they should continue to plan for 24-25. I wrote out in December, which was very much a sort of a steady as she goes proposition, including in particular the need for people to maintain and keep open the extra capacity we have put in over the course of 24-25, both in our acute hospitals, ambulance services, and indeed maintain the extra capacity and investment we have put into mental health. GPs and community services. But we will continue those discussions with government, hope to conclude them soon, and therefore be able to give clear direction to the NHS for next year.
Can I ask a quick question? When we were looking at earlier data, there is a very clear variance in performance across the 42 systems, 42 ICBs. Any reflections on that? Clearly, they all start in different spaces and different places. There's lots of reason why they would have variance. But any reflections?
As you say, there is variation. Some of that is due to actually even the position we saw even as we entered the pandemic back in 2019-20. And as we have recovered, you see some of the historic problems emerge. We have seen very different patterns, as to how the pressures emerge on things like continuing healthcare, which partly reflects differences in practice, even on sort of local authority social care, and how some of the changes in fair cost of care have kind of worked their way through social care and then into the NHS over a period of time. Clearly, there have also been differences in the way people have responded with their workforce, as we went through the pandemic, and differences in the pace at which some, in particular, providers have responded to, as we have come out of the pandemic. I mean, in terms of really making sure we have sort of appropriate management of total workforce, agency spending, bank spending. I mean, I will flag that this year we are seeing cash reductions across the NHS in spending on temporary staffing. I mean, year on year, for the last quarter, we're about 12% down in real terms in terms of spending. That's an actual cash reduction, and reflects, I mean, really how people are, sort of making sure that as we've come through the pandemic, we sort of get back some sort of operational management and a real focus on productivity, off the back of this sort of increase in permanent staffing that Amanda was talking about at the start. So I think it does reflect some variable practice, as well as genuinely some differences in the circumstances that different systems and different providers face. But look, we are clearly working with some of our systems and providers, particularly those who we have put into, sort of enhanced supervisory arrangements to make sure that sort of appropriate recovery plans are in place and appropriate action is being taken to make sure we're managing money, performance and quality as a whole. And
can you remind me the benefit in cash flow terms of actually this very effectively managed merger of NHS England with digital, with HE, with improvement with NHSX, and actually then the headcount reduction and the cost savings? It was done not for cost savings, but there were cost savings that arose. It was done for different reasons of, reducing head office burden upon systems appropriately. But can you remind me of there is a significant cash saving from that exercise which has moved to frontline. Can you remind me of the order of magnitude?
This year, 23-24, I do not have the absolutely precise number by the end, which we will sort of firm up. But this year in 23-24, we will have saved on a recurrent basis around £300 million by the end of the year. We are sort of targeting that by the time that we work our way through to a whole full year effect in the end of next year, I think that number will be over £600 million, all of which is going basically into supporting frontline services, both the maintenance of the sort of capacity that I've just described, as well as our ability to keep investing in mental health, cancer, and various other programs where maternity, as Ruth is reminding me, just to make sure we can continue to invest. And I'd flag that integrated care boards are also well on, not just with the planning, but in many cases the execution of the sort of consolidation of resources also, which is basically freeing up funding to go into frontline services, which I think will add about another 200 million to the number that I just described.
So over that period, about sort of 800 million or so. I mean, it's an order of magnitude. Yeah. About 800 million moved out of layers
on
into the
current
front
basis
line.
as we finish 24-25.
That's very good. Thank you. Well,
Thanks, Richard. So, June, one of the things you very quickly sort of mentioned was productivity and how key that's going to be. Is it worth just expanding on how you're seeing that? It's a very tricky, difficult subject. And certainly, in anecdotal conversations with people outside, I don't think they appreciate, looking back, as we look at the numbers, how productive the NHS has been. And then looking forward, how you're thinking about that in terms of what we have to achieve. And we haven't got the numbers for next year, don't worry, but...
Yeah, sure. I mean, historically, the NHS, has achieved high levels of productivity in the sort of 20 years up to the pandemic. I think it was York University did some analysis which suggested, we outstripped total economy productivity. Clearly, the pandemic was a massive shock to the system, and you can look at similar shocks to other services in the economy, that it does actually take some time to recover. And actually you recover faster where the infrastructure and technology is actually in a good state. And clearly it's highly variable, and we know, across the NHS. Nonetheless, we have seen a hit to output. Some of the numbers, I think, underestimate the impact of increased complexity of cases, frailty, the impact of COVID, actually both on patients, and clearly you have a hit to staffing, because we have seen sort of higher structural sickness, absence. And the one thing we really struggle to capture in a measurable way is the impact on discretionary effort. It's always often said the NHS relies on discretionary effort. But if your staff have been striking for the best part of over a year, you are clearly going to see less discretionary effort in the round. We also need to get better at counting some of the things we do which are not currently captured in some of the official statistics, because we have changed the way that we work, in particular in emergency care, where we are using same-day emergency care much more than we ever were, and we don't really yet capture that well in some of our statistics. And then finally, we also don't really capture, which is not an ideal effect, that effectively rather than admitting people, you're sort of holding people in the emergency department. Now you are actually caring for them, would be better admitting them, but you sort of don't weight that the same way. So some of the headline stats, I think, don't capture everything that's actually gone on. Nonetheless, there has been a productivity hit, and clearly, we are trying to make sure we're improving some of the benchmarking data that is available, so that, in fact, Nick's here from Norwich and has worked elsewhere, so people can just keep working on, how do we keep a focus on recovery, and that does take some time. I mean, in the long run, the way we will sustainably improve productivity will come from, and will only really come from, serious investment, a sustained investment in technology, and we will have to address the problems with our sort of physical infrastructure, in particular the sort of critical backlog maintenance, because we can see over the last 10 years a substantial rise in incidents in the estate, which mean you lose capacity, and we can see that increasing. We have done, some headline estimates, which I don't think are incredibly precise, but suggest, we could be losing 0.1, 0.2% a year at the moment of sort of productivity, simply NHS-wide productivity, simply because we lose, an increasing amount of estate each year. So, that's alongside the sort of management focus, the recovery of sort of really good practice, which has been really hit as we just had to move everything around within our services. it is going to require sustained investment in those areas if we're going to see a substantial change.
Thank you. Ruth, you wanted to
Yes.
ask a question?
It's more of a comment, really, in that Amanda talked earlier about 20,000 more registered nurses going into this winter than last year. Over 1,000 more midwives than this time last year. Over 8,000 more healthcare support workers than this time last year. All of those going into substantive positions will, no doubt, I'd expect agency to come down. Absolutely right, because that's the right thing for patients, right things for quality safety. I think now we'll really need to work on getting people that are on the bank into substantive positions, offering them flexible approaches, and then, of course, our retention work that we're all doing is going to be really important, because the best quality of care will only be provided, I am sure, by the permanent substantive members of staff all of the time. So let's not waste the work that we've done to recruit these people. We really now got to go further and get them from bank onto substantive contracts.
Thank you. Let's move on. Julian, thank you as always. Really, really clear and very, very helpful. So, Sarah Jane, I think you're going to lead on the next item, and you've got Nick Hume and Tracy Bleakley. We've got you with us, which is brilliant.
Tracy and Nick are the stars of this show. So
I'm
just going to say a few words of introduction. I'm going to hand over to my colleagues who are going to bring it to life, what it's meant at System and Trust.
And can you pick up Well's fundamental question? Yeah.
Of course, Chair, thank you. This has come up a few times already, but just to remind people, we have been preparing for this winter for 12 months. The UEC recovery plan was published in January. It was branded NHS England in DHSC, but it was the work of everybody across the NHS. It was based on what everybody in our trusts, in our systems, were telling us were the things that would make a biggest impact going into this winter. It was end-to-end, so it was the first time that a UEC focus plan hadn't just looked at ambulances, A&E departments, or what was happening in hospitals. It had looked end-to-end at all the things that we can do in the community, and it had a really big focus as well on discharge, working with our colleagues in social care. It was all based around system planning, not just doing things in isolation in individual organisations. And the money for the delivery of it was released at the beginning of the year rather than coming out in sort of ad hoc funding as we went into the winter period, which had characterised previous years and was something that people told us they didn't want to see. And that was true for both the NHS part of the funding and also the social care part of the funding. So we were able to spend more time preparing. And then just the other feature of it was that we went into it absolutely determined to be more data-driven in our responses, so that we were really clear at each part of the system where people were, and our new Opal framework actually allows us to see on a 15-minute basis how pressure is building in our systems and allowing people to be able to respond in the most appropriate way. So we spent a lot of time preparing for this, sort of a 12-month run-in. A lot of the resilience that we built was been related to the additional capacity. Other colleagues have mentioned that, so I won't list it out again. But we have had those additional beds, ambulances, virtual wards and so on. Probably the area that hasn't come up, I just want to reinforce, is all the excellent work that has been done around discharge. We often talk about discharge being one of our real constraints, and it continues to be. But it has held up really well in the face of the demands this year. So we have been able to maintain a pretty consistent discharge profile across all of our pathways throughout the year. Sometimes we need to flex and go a little higher, and that can be problematic. But we have managed to hold on to that steady flow of people going out of hospital, and that has no doubt helped us as we've gone into the period. Other colleagues have shared statistics. We obviously focus on the ambulance response times. We know why it's really important to the public, and the A&E sort of 4 hours as well. I just wanted to share one of my own, which I only read about last week and just was so struck by the significance of this. And this is just actually about our 111 services, which is the front door often to patients trying to access urgent care out of hours. We answered in the Christmas week, which is our busiest week ever for 111. We answered the phone 16 minutes quicker than we had in the week for the Christmas period before. and we were able to provide clinical advice to 13,000 more patients than we had done in the previous year. So all the work that we did to get clinicians into call centres, to get our patients' phone back, all of those things had a huge impact. And it's those, I think the point is everything contributes to what we see in some of those headline statistics. So whilst it's important that we look at those, it's important that we look at the drivers of them as well. Nevertheless, it's come at a huge cost, this has. Some of the things that we've achieved are because we have moved pressures around in the system. We've talked a lot about risk management and where we put risk at different parts of the pathway. And I'm really conscious, and we're going to hear this from colleagues in a moment, that we have moved risk out of people's houses and from the back of ambulances, and in some cases we've moved that into emergency departments, we've moved that into wards that have had to take the pressure of taking additional patients on there. And I think that's one of the areas as we move into next year is one of our learnings here, that we need to have a really big focus on what is happening inside our hospitals so that we continue with the performance levels that we're seeing, but we decongest some very, very crowded areas. So just in terms of our learning for taking forwards, we've got 4 big areas of work. The first thing is we need to maintain the capacity. That's easy to say and challenging to do in the face of what Julian talked about, the financial position. So we know it's going to be challenging for organisations, but particularly the core bed base we have to sustain through the course of the year. We then do need to genuinely improve productivity, and we know how to do this. So we know the services that have got the same day emergency care working effectively, they've got their medical admission 72-hour pathways, they're looking to reduce the length of stay of every patient, they discharge before lunchtime. These are the organisations that manage flow better, are able to offload ambulances, that are in a better financial position, that get better quality and outcomes. So it's all the same work. And it will be the second area of focus. And then the third is the coordination, and you'll hear this again from colleagues. It's the coordination of some of the community services. We've got some brilliant work happening, but we need the same rigour in our approach and coordination in our community services, and the same challenges to ourselves around productivity as we have in the acute sector. And then finally, it's looking more broadly at some of the data I talked about before, so primary care, mental health, and the sort of broader community services is all part of our escalation data. At the moment, it is too focused on what is happening in hospitals, which is still a massive advance from what we had previously, but we need to be looking at the whole healthcare system. So I think we could characterise this as we've done an awful lot, but we've still got an awful lot more to do. And it can be true that we have prepared better, that we've delivered better, and that by and large it's, although challenging, we've got through it together, and there is still a lot more that we could and need to do, and that for many patients their experience hasn't been what we would want it to be, and that has had a huge impact on our staff. And both of those things are true, and I think that makes us all determined to take the lessons, take the learning, and really make sure it's time to start planning again, isn't it? It's absolutely. But now my colleagues Tracy and Nick will bring this to life from the Norfolk and Waveney system.
So I don't know who's going to go first, but Tracy, welcome as Chief Executive. Chief Executive of Norfolk and Waveney ICB, and Nick Hume, Chief Executive of Norfolk and Norwich Hospital. So, Tracy.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome everybody to Norwich and Norfolk and Waveney. Our first year as an ICB, 22-23, was awful from a UEC perspective, quite frankly. All of the underlying issues that Julian alluded to factored into this, and we'd had many years of poor performance. So we've got 2 RAC hospitals, massive backlog on our maintenance, huge deficit as well. We don't have an EPR system in our acute. So all the things that will be working against us, plus an ageing and older demographic as well, and very much siloed working. So incredibly polite people here in Norfolk and Waveney, but not an awful lot of system working, not a lot of understanding about what happens outside of the boundaries of the particular organisations. A year ago over Christmas, we went into critical incident in 22 on the 1st of October and came out in February 23. We had an ambulance delay on a Sunday afternoon at one point that was about to hit 24 hours, and I still can't believe I'm saying that out loud. And we had 40 ambulances outside of the Norfolk and Norwich on one day between Christmas and New Year, and I nearly had to declare a major incident. It was awful. amazing support actually from the Tier 1 groups, so around UEC and around discharge and the ESIS teams. And we really did focus on those two things, so discharge and also long length of stay. We stopped calling it discharge here. We call it Right Care Now because we want to actually actively pull people into the right services. It's not about pushing people out and focusing on that. An awful lot of empathy and joint working and joint teams. So, as an example, the Home First team from Norfolk County Council went to work within the community care organisation. Our Unscheduled Care Hub is doing incredibly well because it's co-located with a 111 service and we've got that multidisciplinary team, so it's able to really pitch above its weight. So we managed to reduce our non-criteria to reside number by around 200, working together, and also pull back our long length of stay. We were looking into this winter thinking, right, we're going to, target that 45-minute C2 and then, ambulance handover rather, and then try and get down to the half hour. Nick and I attended a national meeting before Christmas, and we were one of several trusts who had a presentation from Sarah Jane and Julian. And we came out of that and said, could we just say we're not going to tolerate ambulance waits? Could we do that? Is that going to be possible? And we thought, well, we can't just do that as one trust, because if we do, all of the ambulances are going to go there. With the best will in the world, that's where you're going to go as a crew. So could we do this as a system? Came back to Norfolk and Waveney, spoke to all the chairs. They were fantastic and behind this. And although they're not here, I really do have to mention specifically Joe Segersby and Alice Webster, the two chief execs of the district generals, because this is not easy to pull off in a district general. Massive culture change, and we did it incredibly quickly. So Nick always has to go first, decided that he'd go first on the 17th of November and the two district generals on the 1st of December. It has not been easy, but it has been an incredible success in terms of looking at what has been achieved and the difference between last winter and this winter. We've had our challenges, of course. We had the last probably 10 days, 2 weeks, we're proper in winter, and it's going to be for the next 2-3 weeks as well. But it's nothing like it was a year ago. And when we do struggle, the whole system helps each other. You can see on the gold calls that everybody really cares about this and wants to make sure people are not on the kitchen floor, and we do recover much quickly. We know that we are putting in place the long-term transformation to make this work, and we have exciting plans coming up. We're putting in the Optica system, so the transfer of care documents will all be online, and that's going to happen around March time. A new intermediate care model, new facilities opening up, doing things very differently as we work through. And what's been really interesting, and I won't steal Nick's thunder, but we haven't done the old-fashioned thing of jumping on one problem and letting something else go off. Actually, Norfolk and Norwich's performance around FDS, 65-week cancer, 78-week waits, they are still tackling that. We will build on this. We will improve. We have pretty much kept to our financial targets, save for the last period of industrial action. We are absolutely determined here that Norfolk and Waveney will work together well as a system. We'll tackle the really difficult problems one by one, but make sure they're sustainable as well. And it's an incredible privilege, actually, to be leading this system.
Thank you. Nick, I think the microphone goes to you, doesn't it?
Yeah. Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you for inviting me. Privileged to be here. So I'm the interim chief executive at Norfolk and Norwich. I started in the middle of September, and I have another 4 weeks in post, and I return to Suffolk and North East Essex, hopefully not with my tail between my legs. So I suppose the first approach that I took when I came in September was to look at the data and start to do a bit of myth busting. The organisational mantra was all of these delays are caused by delays of social care, delays of community services, and stranded patients without a criteria to reside. As Tracy described, the system had done so well to reduce those, but that information hadn't filtered through. And so that myth busting based on the data, and then a conversation with senior colleagues, including clinicians, about where's the greatest risk. And the greatest risk in the community is the undifferentiated patient being at home without an ambulance. And that was a difficult message to keep pushing, but that was agreed. And so just to give some data, because I was told to bring some numbers, Sarah Jane said, bring some numbers. So in October, the average offload time at the Norfolk and Norwich was 142 minutes. That's the average offload time. And 59% of patients waited more than an hour on an ambulance outside the hospital. In November, that dropped to 63 minutes for an average offload, with 28% of patients waiting an hour. And in December, it reduced even further to 24 minutes average offload delay. That's taking 2 hours off the average offload delay, and 8% waiting more than an hour. It has increased a little bit through January, with 31 minutes average offload and 13% waiting more than an hour. An extraordinary turnaround led by extraordinary people. However, it has come at a cost. And what we have done is, quite simply, move the risk from people's homes into the corridors, into the additional patients that we're caring for on the wards. And that is really difficult for the staff. But it is better for the community. And I think that challenge of understanding, the understanding that our clinicians and our nurses and all of our staff have now, that this is making a difference to the communities that we serve, although it is putting significant pressure on your working days. And as I often say to the staff, you will never know the names of the lives of the people that you have saved. You will never know the names of the people who will have a better recovery after a stroke or a heart attack because they've had a quicker response from the ambulance. And that's really difficult because they can see the pain, but they can't necessarily see the benefit. So I think one of the challenges we have as leaders is to always get the narrative exactly clear about why people are doing it and why we're doing it. My goodness, is it fragile? I have not relaxed and thought, well, that's done, move on, go back to Suffolk. It is absolutely minute by minute. So what we are attempting to do is to create a space for the next 10 ambulances every hour. The next 10 ambulances every hour, 24/7, 7 days a week. And that does mean looking after patients in areas that are not designed to look after patients. It does mean asking staff to do things differently. It is building the plane whilst trying to fly it. So all the transformation work we need to do around 7-day working, around working with people's job plans to ensure that we've got more senior decision makers at the front door, all the work we need to do with our colleagues in the community is the work that we've now started with a very detailed and managed transformation programme to take the lessons learned and then to move into that transformation. We're not out of the woods. It is incredibly fragile, but it's been a privilege to be part of it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So I'm going to open up for comments or questions. That, if I throw one first to sort of all three of you, how confident are you? You said fragile. How confident are you that we can lock in a sort of a firm base and now improve again, getting ready for next winter? That would be my question.
We're absolutely committed to doing that, aren't we?
But commitment I get. Yeah. I get commitment, confidence.
I think from my perspective, the one shift that I have noticed within the hospital site, within the acute site, is the recognition of why people are doing it. So the hearts and minds of people recognising. And as one nurse said to me, Nick, if you'd asked me to do this to improve ambulance turnaround, I wouldn't have done it. What you've done about is about saving lives. It's about improving lives. And there is something very different, as I've learned working outside London, is that almost all the patients, all the staff who use the hospital, it's their community. Yeah. And therefore we're talking about treating people from your village, from your city, from your community, and linking into that hearts and minds has been really important. My degree of confidence, I think it's a really difficult question, which is probably why you asked it. But I think so I'm confident that there's been a shift in hearts and minds. I'm confident there's been a shift in attitude and some shift in behaviours. But I think, in a sense, the heavy work starts now because it does require talking to people who've worked traditionally for 20 years about a different way of delivering their job plan. It does require asking people to take a different approach to risk around sending people home when they're well enough and not well. So I think that's the heavy work. Yep. So I'm confident of the change of attitude, some change in behaviour, but I think the delivery is, as I say, incredibly fragile.
Thank you. Amanda, I know you want to ask it.
Well, it's a build, actually, if that's all right, Richard, on the question you just answered about confidence. And it's a sort of I'm interested in understanding a little bit from both of your perspectives about where the system adds value by being able to do things that an organisation on its own wouldn't be able to do. So in terms of sustaining that kind of well, Nick, you've described it brilliantly, transforming at the same time as actually kind of doing the hard yards, operational delivery. You've touched on community, keeping patients out of hospital who don't need to be there. You've touched on discharge. You've touched on capacity. You've touched on changing pathways. So I'd just be really interested from both of you in the sort of, so what's your reflection on what's made both it possible now because of system rather than just organisation, and what would then be the sort of next year plan? And by the way, because we've been talking about data and how important it is, as we've been talking, I've called up what your Opal position is right now and how many ambulances there are outside the Norfolk and Norwich right now. So your point about the pressure and the fragility is clearly really real, and that's why I think this is such an important kind of conversation.
He does this to me all the time as well, don't
Sorry.
My niece is
and if you told me 3 months ago that this is the day you were going to visit, I could have predicted exactly what our Opal score would have been and exactly how many ambulances would be outside. I suppose from our perspective, the system work has been really important, and I think the response, for example, that we've had when things have got really difficult. So there's the kind of the building and the system and the, if you like, the what we bed into system. But then there's the kind of the balloon goes up, we need your help now. And for both of those, I think it's a really good system to work in. For me, I think where I to be staying, I would absolutely concentrate, and I think it is not so much at the back end. And I think what we learnt, if there was anything positive to take from industrial action, we do know that if we have senior decision makers at the front door 24/7 with the ability to refer patients to pathways that are not acute hospital based, and that's the key, and that's where the community, and that's where hot clinics, and that's where quicker diagnostics come in, and it is admitting people to assess them, or rather assessing them to admit them rather than the other way around. So that's where I'd concentrate. Future system working is absolutely about, why is it that after 7 o'clock at night the most significant criteria for admission is living alone? What can we do about people where we can wrap around something so that doesn't mean they get admitted just for no clinical reason except that they live alone? So that's where I'd be looking for the system to really step up, is alternatives to admission rather than, we will have delayed discharges, sadly, for, that will always, in a sense, be part of our systems. I think where we can really get the gain is to avoid admission.
Thank you. So Wal's got I'm going to move us on quite quickly, but Wal's got a question, and then it's Steve.
Answer to that.
So Tracy, your answer, and there are 2 more questions coming, and then I'm going to start truncheoning the time, I think, but anyway.
So from a system perspective, Amanda, I can tell you this afternoon that NCH&C have opened 7 more surge beds in the community, and we're having a 4 o'clock meeting to look at discharge specifically out of the Norfolk and Norwich. So the whole system is pulling together this afternoon, not just for you. In terms of sustainability, we know that we have made big inroads into our non-CTR number and improving right Ken out the back door, as we call it, with discharge. That will be sustained, and we'll keep improving on that. We're doing some great work actually in social care about downgrading people from P2 to P1, making sure they retain their independence. But one of the big things that struck me over the past few weeks, and we are now able to really hone down to some of these issues, are the number of people aged over 75 who are going in with respiratory conditions, and they're being admitted because they're knocked off their feet. We need a completely different model for looking at people, keeping people in their own home, admission avoidance, and being able to look after them with respiratory illness over Christmas, and we'll be focusing on that.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask,
just very quickly.
Well, you ask your question, then Steve, and then take them both, as it were.
Very, very quickly. We've been talking about risk, but lumping it into one. I'm just interested to know how you break it down, because I'm going to characterise this completely unfairly, but clinical risk has trumped everything in the past. Clearly, you've done quite an extraordinary, performance improvement in the space of months. That must have involved taking other kinds of risk and putting them up to the same level, and then working together with clinicians and managers and what have you to sort of say, actually, this is okay. Has that been part of it? And the real question is, going forward, where else can we start to unpack risk, really understand it, using data to say, actually, we can do this in this way?
So you're going to get 3 questions to hold, so you might want to scribble, because David's also coming in. So Steve?
Well, a comment and a question, because I think the story that you've told about that understanding of risk and the risk that is occurring in a group of the population that is not in front of your eyes and you're not dealing with is a really important cultural change. And actually, I've seen that in many places I've visited over the course of this year, and the difference between last winter, where people were talking about it, to this year, where I think increasingly people have understood and acted on it, I think is one of the real differences. But of course, it's not the only thing that's made a difference this winter, and you've touched on some of the things, and there are other areas such as virtual wards. And I just wondered, from your perspective, how far have you got with some of those other things, and what is the opportunity to go further for next winter?
And then the last question in the batch, David.
It's more of a point, really, that I just want to draw out. I think in a private meeting, we actually acknowledged just the progress that has been made to build improvements on comparative months previous years, and congratulated Emily and Sarah Jane for the work with the teams that have gone on. But I just want to pull out what Tracy and Nick have talked about, because I think there's a lesson in leadership here about how to lead. I think complex problems require teams to solve them made up of different groups of people. But unless they collaborate and work compassionately with each other, that's Nick's point about how do you harness the hearts and minds of people rather than say, we've got a target, please deliver on this, is critical. And I just don't think as a national board we should let that point go, because it's absolutely critical, I think, to how you motivate people and give them hope. The reason they went into this in the first place is still relevant today. So, well done. Congratulations.
So it's a very good reflection, which I think we would all agree with. Yeah. Actually, thank you for. At which point you've got two questions, I think, to have a go at, if you can, between you and Nick.
Thank you. So very quickly on virtual ward, we leaned into very early on step up as well as step down, actually, and being able to flex those models. And we are absolutely looking at how we can both learn from and improve those models and extend them. So they are part of our planning. I will hand over to Nick to talk about risk. But I do want to mention that when we have looked from an ICB perspective and looking at system risk, we have introduced patient experience and moral injury, because I think it's been really important to capture those so they don't get conflated in wider risk. But I'll just bring Nick in.
Thank you. What we attempted to do, and I'm delighted that we'll be hosting some colleagues tomorrow at the hospital, and you'll see some more detail of this, and I'll share it round with the papers if that's okay, is that we have a minimum risk escalation matrix. So that we say that we agree that as a trust, that the trust will not accept delays to patients requiring an ambulance in their place of residence, is the highest risk to our system, not necessarily to our organisation, but our system. And then it works down with the lowest risk being business as usual. So we go from risk of being the highest is that people in their own homes, the next is people in an ambulance, the next is people in ED, and then finally when we get into the real detail around the kind of escalation plan that we have within the hospital, we're very clear about, for example, how many additional patients on a ward, and then working through the lowest risk is probably corridor care in ED, which is not great and nobody wants that, right through to caring for additional patients in areas on the wards that are not designed for those patients. So we've got a very clear risk matrix and we have various escalation triggers. Have we got complete buy-in from everybody? No. It's absolutely a work in progress, and I'm sure for those of you who I'll be delighted to host tomorrow, you'll hear a range of views about the approach that we're taking. But I think in a sense the simplicity, and I do have the confidence that what we have done has made a difference to lives that we'll never know, and that's really, really difficult, I think. But I also remember, I mean, it's sort of a credit to the national team, really. I do remember that webinar probably a year ago, Steve, maybe slightly longer, where you were absolutely clear about the shared risk of a system. And I would agree with you that they were kind of words and expectation a year ago. I think right across, in certainly my experience, which is only mainly in the east of England, we've seen it actually delivered. And maybe there's a lesson there about recognising that sometimes it does take time for people to get to that place.
Thank you, and Tracy, thank you, and Sarah Jane. Thank you, it's been a really good conversation, actually. So let's move on, if we might, and the next item is Amanda Doyle and David Webb, our Chief Pharmaceutical Officer, and it's an update for us on Pharmacy First service.
Thank you. So You may remember that when we published the delivery plan for recovering access to primary care back in May last year, we had some commitments around how we might better use the clinical skills and capacity within community pharmacy to move further in the direction of delivering greater clinical services. And one of the commitments was to launch the Pharmacy First service, which was an additional range of clinical pathways for high volume, common but not necessarily minor conditions for which, although pharmacists could recognise and advise patients, these conditions often needed prescription-only medication, sometimes antibiotics, and so pharmacies were unable to treat those conditions. So in addition to the existing community pharmacy consultation service for minor illness, we have developed pathways for 7 common conditions. And we also committed to increase the role of community pharmacy in the provision of contraceptive services by expanding the existing repeat prescription service for the oral contraceptive pill, but also moved to allow patients to obtain first prescriptions for oral contraceptive pill through their local community pharmacy, and also to significantly expand and improve the role of community pharmacy in the diagnosis and management of high blood pressure. As part of this, there was a commitment to a significant investment in the underpinning IT infrastructure, largely around the connection between general practice and community pharmacy to enable shared access to records, smoother referral of patients into appointments in community pharmacies, and information back directly into GP records, so that the clinical information and particularly the prescriptions issued via community pharmacy become part of the patient's electronic record. Really pleased to say that in December we launched the expanded contraception service and blood pressure service, and as Amanda said, we launched the new Pharmacy First service yesterday as planned. We went live in 10,200 pharmacies, which is 95% of all the pharmacies in England, across 16,500 sites. We had more than 9,800 Pharmacy First consultations on the first day. And this has been really, really positively received, not only from patients, but from the pharmacy sector, who are really keen, as you can see by the numbers of sign-up, but really positive about the ability to widen the range of clinical services that are delivered alongside the traditional dispensing services, but is a game changer around getting us into a position to continue to develop this, and the IT infrastructure that I cannot overstate how much hard work's been carried out by the transformation team to get this in place. 6 clinical system suppliers made huge changes to the way their systems operate. More than 30,000 updates to the Directory of Services were put in place to enable 111 to refer directly into these services. So it's a lot of the work under the surface has been absolutely huge. So really well done to the teams that have delivered this. David, I don't know if you wanted to comment on the clinical aspects.
Do have some time for, I'm sure there are going to be some comments or questions, so if you want to come in relatively succinctly on clinical aspects.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I think there are 3 sort of dimensions that are really important around this development. The first one is integration. The second one, I think, is inclusion. And Amanda pointed to the fact that we have more pharmacies in areas of higher deprivation than we do in areas of lower deprivation, which I think is a very important point. And then the third dimension I think is really relevant here is impact, and that's access to appropriate care at the right time when people need it. And just swinging back to my colleague Amanda's point is we are entering a new era, I think. This is about recognising and developing the clinical pharmacy services within community pharmacy. And it's a start on this journey, I think. This is a really impressive moment. I would like to say thank you to everybody. It's been a team of teams effort across NHS England with our colleagues in DHSC and importantly the frontline professionals who are now delivering these services to patients. Initial feedback is that ability to close an episode of care appropriately, to sort of have somebody present, be able to recognise what's wrong and then provide the treatment that the person needs then. That's already coming through as a positive professional aspect of the service too. So I think in the interest of time, Chair, if I sort of hold it there, is that okay? And I'll take some questions.
Let me just open it up to comments. So Steve first. Steve, yeah.
Just an additional point. So everybody around the board table understands the importance of antimicrobial resistance and ensuring that we guard against increased resistance of antimicrobials, and clearly in extending the prescription of antibiotics into an additional setting, in this case pharmacies, it's really important that we bear that in mind and manage that risk. So I just want to assure the board, it's in paragraphs 9 and paragraph 18, that we did engage expert clinical reference groups in designing these pathways to ensure that any risk of increasing antimicrobial resistance was addressed and the pathways are optimised for the appropriate use of antibiotics. That has been scrutinised by our AMR programme board here, including by myself, with input from the Chief Medical Officer. But it's really important that we evaluate this service. And I draw your attention to paragraph 18, and I think one of the important things that we're doing is engaging the National Institute of Health and Care research in an evaluation programme of the service.
Thank you.
Sorry, was that Mary first?
Yes.
Mary, yes, sorry.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask whether you anticipated it reducing calls to 111, and also whether in some areas, because pharmacies are open later, that it would make it much easier for people who work to get some things resolved very quickly.
Hold these, so it's the same system, hold the questions and then we'll back to
Extending Mary's point, coming at this from a perspective of how are we going to measure the success of the initiative? Because on one dimension, yes, of course, it's access for patients, out of hours and whatever, but is it reduced incidence of people turning up A&E for, I mean, I didn't see much of that in here, and you've got it, I'm sure, but just like a little bit more on that.
And then my only question is, reading the IT system connectivity, and clearly there's been a huge amount of work. I couldn't quite work out from the paper to what extent we've completed a seamless interaction between the pharmacy sector and the patient's record in primary care. And it would be quite helpful just to get us an assurance or an understanding of where that work is and how much more needs to be done. So do you want to have a go at those, David and Amanda?
So the 111 and A&E, which are both sort of related, when we initially did this work, this was about freeing up capacity or taking some of the pressure off general practice. These are largely services currently provided in general practice, but of course 111 tends to be the front door to out-of-hours primary care, urgent primary care services, and so there will be an impact because pharmacies tend to be open at weekends and sometimes later in the evenings than general practice. Large numbers of 111 calls often relate to medicine, and particularly access to urgent medicine. People who've not realised they've run out of their inhalers or their repeat prescriptions. Part of the Pharmacy First service, we've rolled in the urgent repeat medication service, and so that's the reason why it's so important to do those proper underpinning updates so that patients from 111 can be immediately flowed into those services. So of course, initially it's really important that 111 can signpost the patients to the appropriate service. As people get used to the availability of these services and where they can go, we would hope that people will go directly. We have got planned a big public communications campaign which is due to launch second week of February to talk to people about this.
Well, I'm going to hold you. So there's one more question coming in, and then I'm going to give you with huge apologies, about 3 minutes to deal with them all. But Mark, you want to...
This question is probably directed at Steve, which is good clinical practice quite often requires culture for infections. That will be part of the pathways? I'm saying good clinical practice often requires culture. before you prescribe antibiotics. That's part of the pathway, is it?
Well, part of the pathways is to ensure that, well, firstly, that there are a set of standardised pathways for people to follow, but it's also the appropriate training to ensure that that those pathways are followed and any diagnostics as part of those pathways are understood. And I think all of that then is part of the cultural response as well.
So, I think a couple more questions you've still got to pick up. Do you want to just finish those for me?
So the A&E question really sits with the 111 question, I think, and that's about demand in other parts of the system. What's really important about the IT infrastructure aspects of this service is this is the first setting whereby the post-event, the post-consultation information will flow directly into the workflow in the GP clinical system rather than coming as a letter that comes through the NHS mail and then has to be dealt with manually. So this is actually a huge step forward, and that will roll out completely, and correct me if I'm wrong, over about the next 2 weeks. It's happening in some places already, depending on which different systems are in place, but will happen for all pharmacy and GP IT systems. And that's really been the big part of the work we've asked system suppliers to do, to which they've responded really well.
So thank you.
I think I might have answered a different question to the one that Mark asked,
I think you did,
which was around the culture of asking for antibiotics.
Yes, it's culture in the microbe, not the...
Oh, culture in the microbe, yeah.
Oh, goodness.
That's
one for the cognition.
So it's an even different question. It's a culture in the microbe. So part of well, I did partly answer it because the expert reference groups look very carefully at the diagnostics that would be required. So culture is not part of that, but there are other checks and balances.
So I'm going to pause that debate between the cognoscenti, if I might, and just say thank you very much. It is, I utterly agree, a really brilliant initiative. And partly we haven't said it because it allows us to engage with a highly skilled workforce, highly skilled pharmacists, and their then ability to come and contribute to the provision of health care into primary care. I think it's brilliant. It will give 10 million, I think estimated 10 million more potential appointments, or it takes pressure off primary care GPs practices for about 10 million appointments or so. But actually it's also for patients, the ease of access, the breadth of access, everyone's within the range of a community pharmacy. So, congratulations on it. I think it's a really brilliant initiative, and thank you very much.
We often talk about culture around this table, but I think that's the first time I've been asked about culture of microbes.
Yeah, be careful what you wish for, is all I can say. So let's move us...
Mind shift.
So Amanda and David, thank you. Let's go on to a really important topic, actually. Claire Murdoch and Liz Durrant. So it's the mental health paper. Do you want to introduce it relatively briefly? I'm sure there are going to be comments and questions on this. It's a very important topic.
Thank you, Chair. Just to pick up on something that our Chief Executive and yourself said earlier, we must all acknowledge that mental health services are operating under extreme pressure. We're seeing 1.2 million more people than we saw back in 2016. Our inpatient services are running red hot. Our urgent and emergency care pathways, similarly, whether that's discharge at the back end or what happens in A&E or the community or out of area placements. So I think it's really important that we do all acknowledge that. And often during periods of crisis, we know it's when patients are at their very most vulnerable and they need a timely response in the most appropriate setting. And we need both the workforce and the clinical models to ensure we deliver that. When they come into hospital, it's absolutely vital that the culture of care, the effectiveness of care and the outcomes are the right ones. So our workforce have been leaning into, as you said earlier, they've been leaning into the mental health challenge and I think overwhelmingly come to work to do a good job. But it would be true to say that we don't always have the right skills in the right place at the right time. And part of what this programme, which Liz is going to take us through in a moment, will focus on is people working in both the inpatient area and the alternative services really having a good, fulfilling and rewarding jobs and the skill set to conduct the care that they give to a high standard. As part of formulating this programme, we've had huge engagement with people with lived experience, ICB chiefs, their teams, trusts, third sector partners and others. And I'm pleased to say that there is overwhelming appetite for improving the quality of care that we give and also changing it. I think your point, Amanda, earlier about it's not just about more care. It's about the right care. And this programme's all about that. Such is the level of need and the level of appetite that I'm really pleased to announce today that we are investing £75 million a year recurrently to support this programme. We're asking ICBs to create 3-year plans to both localise care and improve the quality of care that we provide, and change the model of care. But this is recurrent funding, obviously subject to negotiations, but we're delighted to announce this to support this really important programme. And my colleague Liz will tell you just a little bit more about what's the content of this programme.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, colleagues. Claire and colleagues attended just over a year ago in the immediate aftermath of the horrendous events that took place in the Edenfield Centre in Greater Manchester. And the board asked us to focus in this programme on how we can change the model of care within mental health inpatient services, how we can focus on culture, not in the microbe sense, but in the changing culture and practice sense, and to keep patients and families at the heart of everything that we do. Yesterday, NHS England published the independent review of the events that took place in Manchester, and Professor Oliver Shanley, who led the review, concluded that at the heart of the problems in Manchester, a lack of value placed on patients and their families was critical to all that went wrong. Our programme is based on the fundamental risk factors of closed 24/7 psychiatric institutions, as well as all the great engagement that we've had. And there are 3 particular areas of focus that I wanted to draw the board's attention to today. The first is that we've asked every ICB across the country to reconsider the inpatient services that they commission for their population. We've asked them to, first of all, know where all their people are, as many people are placed very far away from those who know and love them. We've asked them to find out what it's going to take to bring those people home and to do so. And we've asked them to think quite differently about the models of care that they're buying so that they are in line with both the evidence base and what people and families tell us. Secondly, we've launched a culture change programme this month, which is available to every NHS trust and provider of NHS commissioned mental health inpatient services, which really focuses ward to board on how do we achieve a culture of care for all of our people, that's our patients, their families and our staff. And finally, we're in the process of developing early warning signs, as we know that the way in which we measure quality of care isn't working for us in the mental health sector, and it means that we're not intervening early when we know that things aren't going well. And we plan to test those suite of measures against events that took place in Manchester so that we can tell whether or not, if we'd have had those measures in place, we would have been able to intervene earlier. Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm going to open it up for any comments and questions. There is a particular paragraph which we have sort of delved into earlier on today, actually, in a really quite deep conversation on the challenges in this space, and it's in this one, Para 25, about the 2 rate limiting factors, and they are here workforce growth, retention, and recruitment. And then actually the second is addressing the quality issues that exist with the physical estate. Do you have comments on how would you reflect on those 2 rate limiting areas?
Yes, thank you. I mean, Liz will add there, but workforce are central to our ability as the NHS, and it's no different in mental health services, to deliver overwhelmingly what we do. If we look at the patients coming into hospital in particular, they're often our most poorly, our most vulnerable, and our most ill. And it's absolutely critical that we really take this opportunity to revisit not only the grade, skills and experience of the workforce that we have in the inpatient area, but also the mix of staff that we have. So doctors and nurses are fundamental, and we're paying particular attention to mental health nursing within the inpatient area because we do worry about the vacancy levels. But it's also about other therapists, occupational therapists, peer support workers, families being more welcome into this space. So it's absolutely vital. We've doubled the nurse training pipeline from about 2,500 to 5,500 a year now, so more than doubled. And that's a really important step, but it still won't be enough to meet demand and need now. So the retention piece and making this work rewarding work that they can feel, staff can feel proud of, and creating safe and therapeutic spaces actually will be as good for our staff, better for working in, as it will for our patients. So workforce is key, and we do need to take the opportunity to review it. In terms of the physical estate, look, there's some good things we're doing. We're eradicating dormitories, and that seems to me something we should have done a long time ago in mental health units, but we're far down that journey now. However, even when we've done that, we've still got some very old, very dilapidated estate that's not conducive to dignified care, therapeutic care, modern care, including actually the integration of digital services and care. So we absolutely do think that the quality of the environment's fundamental.
I'm not going to bring Liz in this, but I know, Ruth, you want to make a comment, ask a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, so we'll take Ruth, and then we'll take David, and then Amanda. And then if you can deal with that batch of three, that would be great. Ruth?
So Claire's absolutely right. Mental health nursing is much more of a challenge in terms of the vacancies and the numbers of staff we've got increasing. We have 2,500 more mental health nurses this now compared to this time last year. We'll have over 4,000 mental health nurses graduate each year now compared to 2,300. So there is hope for optimism, but it's the inpatient areas that struggle most because the challenge is greater. So there is much more we need to be doing around that working environment so that we can support our mental health nurses so they want to stay. So the retention is really going to be important as part of this programme, isn't it, with mental health nursing? Okay,
so hold that thought. David, do you want to come
Yeah,
in?
I remember when this came 12 months ago, Liz and Claire, and we'd had the Panorama programme, and I think there was a sense of, it just quite took your breath away really, because it's not the first time we'd seen poor care in closed institutions or indeed in some open institutions. And I remember the conversation we had about how do we avoid a plan which is just making a sequence of technical recommendations and changes and actually begins to address the culture. And I just want to recognise and value the fact that in paragraphs 15 and 16, where you've set out the action you're taking, there's a real and significant attempt to address the culture. My own view, and I don't want to go back over this, but I thought the failure at Edenfield was a failure of the governance of the board and of clinical governance. And I think what you're setting out in these paragraphs is a way of working to develop both the capacity and capability of both clinical oversight as well as the board oversight. And I just think that's really crucial to get that transformative but sustainable change. Can I just then make the connection to what we talked about on the discharge, about how you do this is important. Connecting why people are going into these jobs and what they do with the job they do, I just think is really important. And that was a lesson in leadership that I wanted to pull out really, because I think it helps us understand how we do tackle some of these intractable problems that we've got. So I just want to thank both of you for actually bringing forward a strategy which I think is beginning to address some of the underlying challenges that we've got in some of the services and systems that we've got. And actually they change when we support them to change, not when we say this isn't good enough change. And I think that's getting alongside people and helping them. So well done.
Very good. Thank you, David. So Amanda?
I've just got a really quick build actually on David's points. So I think I know what you're going to say, but I just want to ask explicitly, just in relation to the independent review of Greater Manchester Mental Health NHS Foundation Trust, which was published yesterday, which obviously was the thing we talked about a year ago that kicked off a lot of this work. Now that that report by Professor Shanley has been produced, has it changed anything? I know you've only had like a day to read it properly, but so it's probably really unfair. But I know you've been aware of the themes as they've been developing. But is there anything immediate that you would say now, in light of the review, you want to change in the approach that's been described today, or anything further that you think you'd want to explore further, or are you content as far as you can be in 24 hours that actually there is a really good alignment between the findings and the programme? So, I mean, I don't think Ruth and David just made really good comments, so there was no need necessarily to respond to those, acknowledge. That's a specific question. Mary, I think you've got a question, and then I'm going to move us on after.
Thank you. I am slightly worried. I do understand the sociological term of psychiatric institutions, but we really need to think about what terminology we want to use if we want people to change. And as a mental health nurse myself, I feel that I've only ever worked in mental health facilities or hospitals. So I just think we're falling into the trap that they're different and they shouldn't be. And I think Claire put it so well about access to family and visitors. The closed nature of these places is because it is too far for people to pop in and see what's going on. And so bringing care closer to people's homes is also going to be fundamental. Okay, so you might want to react to that comment from Mary, but also a very specific question from Amanda.
Thank you. I'm going to be very brief and go first, and would like to give Liz the final word because she is driving this, and it's a tremendous programme, and I'm very grateful to her. I think in terms of the Manchester report, two huge things we take away from that. And Liz has said the voice of staff, and above all the voice of patients and their families, were not sufficiently heard, and there wasn't a systematic way of the board and everybody in between hearing the experience of staff on the boards, and we need to create those systems that endure and is sustainable and real. And the second thing very much was the governance and oversight, and this programme will work with boards on how do they know and what more can they do, and so we'll get alongside colleagues to help them really, really have that good governance and oversight, we hope. So I'm going to say that and just hand over to Liz, who has worked so hard on this, along with colleagues.
Thank you, Claire. I think it's probably made me reflect on some of the aspects of the programme we should go faster on, perhaps. So we've got a trust who are currently trialling a Freedom to Speak Up Guardian for patients. So it's somebody with lived experience who works in a similar role to a Freedom to Speak Up Guardian for staff. And we've got another trust piloting incident reporting by patients. And I think we might need to accelerate some of those learnings. And then, Mary, I think we couldn't agree more with you about, we know the risk factors. I could write down now a unit that is in the middle of nowhere where the family can't visit, that has got people from all over the country in it. That's a risky unit, and we need to be acting in that way. We don't need to wait for that to happen. We just need to know that's risky and take action now to reduce the use of them. And I think, again, equally, when we're not having frequent use of advocates and advocacy services, that's another great sign. So completely agree. Thank you.
Close the topic. Thank you very much for the paper. Thank you for the engagement. It clearly is part of our service under very, very real stress, and we're seeing huge levels of demand growth coming at us, and clearly there's much to be done. But thank you very much for the topic. Okay, can we move on then? So we're going to move on to the Transformation and Innovation Delivery Update. Vin, I think you're leading, and I think I said earlier, I'm delighted that we've got Joe Harrison, who, as well as being Chief Executive at Milton Keynes, is also leading on the NHS app work with Helen Clifton as well. Delighted to see you both here. But Vin, do you want to give us the highlights of the paper? Because there's going to be lots of commentary on it, I think, or questions.
Thank you, Chair. So thank you. Well, digital and data have been the themes, actually, we've seen through every agenda item today. I just wanted to make 3 brief points about the paper. So the first thing I think is to say that where have we come from? So the NHS still lags behind our other international health systems in terms of our digital maturity. We don't have universal access to electronic patient records. We don't universally have shared care records. Anyone who's been to hospital will know you can't just automatically dial up into your computer and see an X-ray or a scan that's been seen somewhere else. And you just have to talk to members of staff about the frustrations they feel with some of our technology that's available in trusts. That said, there has been investment, certainly over the last 5 years, and what the paper sets out is a very significant set of achievements that I think we as an NHS in England have made. So very briefly, I think first thing, the biggest achievements are 90% of trusts in England now have an electronic patient record. We did that ahead of schedule, but we still have 10% that haven't, one of which is in Norfolk and Waveney, where they're doing great work in preparing the business case for theirs across 3 of their trusts. Primary care, we've heard, is on track now, not just to deliver Pharmacy First, which has been a real innovation, actually, in the ability to write into a GP record, but also modern ways now of registering with your GP and ways in which you can interact with your GP for triage and modern telephone systems. We have a modern federated data platform that this board has heard about before. The Optica system for discharge that Tracy mentioned is a federated data platform product. So we're seeing real benefits from the data platform now. And in addition to the NHS app, which Joe and Helen will talk about in a minute, we have also created 12 sub-national secure data environments where fully anonymised patient data can be used for the purposes of research. And the NHS Spine, I think it's important to remember that as a result of the merger, we're now one of the providers of the largest digital and data services in Europe. The NHS Spine handles the records of every single person registered in the NHS and the records of people who've previously been looked after in the NHS, and has been migrated over the last year to the cloud with no reduction in service levels and a more productive and more efficient service. The third point I'd make, though, is I'm pleased to say that we are in constructive discussions about how we do increase our investment in technology in forthcoming years, particularly to deliver both productivity but also patient benefit, better patient experience, safer clinical care, and all the things that you would expect, through the quadruple aim. And if we're going to do this, I think we're not going to just be able to achieve better outcomes for patients and a better experience for patients and our staff, but also we'll be able to leverage the assets we've got in the UK in life sciences, in manufacturing, in data science, in computer science, in AI, in machine learning, to enable us really to deliver benefits not just in the experience of patients, but in the form of new treatments and new insights into disease that will benefit patients in the future. And they will be truly transformational, I think, for the delivery of healthcare in the future. So those are the 3 key points I wanted to make, Chair. And I'm going to hand over to my colleagues who've already introduced. They're the fantastic team who've led all the work on the NHS app, which has been one of the most transformational things we can do. So, Joe, over to you.
Thank you, Vin. And I'll start by saying that this board is presiding over what is, I believe, the biggest change in how the NHS engages with its citizens that we have seen for many, many decades. We're in a place now whereby we have got more than 3/4 of our adults who have downloaded the app. We've got 97% of our practices able to communicate with those patients. And the numbers just keep growing exponentially. And there are lots of numbers that you've heard today, but over 4 million people a day accessed their medical records last week. This is an appetite that we are fulfilling through the NHS app that people didn't necessarily know existed, but is changing the way that our citizens engage with us. And we've only just started. So the last 12 months we've presided, and Helen and the team have delivered against all of the priorities that were set, and have delivered early on a couple of them. Now, it's not often you can say that about really big tech programs in the NHS. So it is to celebrate, and one should, as a member of this board, you should be celebrating this hugely. But it's so much more than that.
from a productivity perspective, from an engagement perspective, and from the way that we can and will change the way that we deliver care across our NHS. It is staggering. And let me just talk about a few of the things that we're doing. I won't take up all the remaining time, I promise, Chair. We've started over the last 12 months of putting basic functionality into the app. Stuff that people want, to be able to look at their appointments, their letters, to engage at a time of their choosing with our NHS. Our citizens absolutely love it. Have we got countrywide coverage yet? Not quite yet. No, we haven't. Is there more to do? Of course there is. It was brilliant hearing about Pharmacy First and 111. It's even better sitting here knowing that we've already integrated 111 onto the front page of the app that has already got integrated in it the Pharmacy First pathway. And so when we talk about have people picked up the phone to 111, I sort of hope they don't, because we know that those that are using 111 on the app have got better completion rates than those that are using it through the web. And we know that we can move more and more people to managing their own care through the app. So let's talk about a couple of other things that we're going to do. At the moment, the app's focused on people that need the NHS to support their illness. We've got a full programme coming up over the next 12 months to move the vaccination and screening programmes onto the app, because we know that patients who book their own appointments are more likely to turn up for them. And the more patients we can get screened, vaccinated, the better. We're putting the digital health check onto the NHS app. I have to say, to start with, it's not going to be amazing. But, I shouldn't say but, I should say and we have to start somewhere, which is allow the patient to order their home testing kit and send it back. Because we know over the next year, 2 years, 5 years, that home testing kit will be available on their phone. It will be available electronically. And if you don't believe me, I looked yesterday at the camera that sits by the bedside that takes all of the vital signs of the patient in front of them without touching the patient. And when you then think about what that might do to the new hospital programme and how that tech can evolve, and when we talked about virtual wards earlier on, how do we connect the virtual ward technology into the NHS app so that citizens can use that and monitor their health data? Most of us have wearables on us. The future of how we use our NHS app and giving our citizens their digital account to manage their own healthcare is stunning. And for those that don't believe, and there are some, we are saying, I think very conservatively, that we want to move a third of all of our health interactions to being digital first over the next 5 years. If we can do that, then what we're doing is we're enabling our NHS to cope with the relentless demands that we've talked about in every aspect of the services around the table, because we know the money isn't always going to be there to keep going up. So this, I have no doubt, is the future of the NHS. And I've got Helen here, who is just brilliant with the team and gets into the detail and gets into the numbers in a way that you cannot imagine. And it's how we enable Helen, the team, through Vin, to keep investing, because the efficiencies and the productivity, getting people back to work, helping our economy are huge.
So Helen, I'm going to
pause there.
That's a hell of a billing. I'm looking forward to hear it. Just a couple of minutes, because there are hands going up all around the board. So you've got to give us time to ask you some questions.
I think answering questions is fine. I think Joe's said it all. I think there are so many amazing human stories that come out of being able to interact directly with services and experiences through the mobile device. And I've heard many of those as well, and sometimes we don't touch on that in terms of what it means to people to be able to navigate it through to the right service or find a way to self-serve and self-manage, because people do want to take the burden away from the NHS and help out where they can.
Okay, we'll get, Mark's hand came up first, very fast on the draw there, Mark, so you go first, and then we'll go round, I think.
Well, those were terrific presentations. I think I'd buy anything from you. But I am an enthusiastic, I'm quite evidence-based, so I am an enthusiastic user of the app, and it gets me my blood test results back faster than I've ever had them before. From turning up in a general practice, it gets me my repeat prescriptions.
Yeah.
So it is fantastically useful. And I think it, as you say, has a long way to go. But I just want to return to where Vin started, which is actually just the power of data for improving patient health. And that actually needs to happen through research and innovation. And I think that there is one missing and important piece from this, which is the workforce that has the advanced training and skills to develop and use it. And I think it's not a discussion for this afternoon, but I think it's one of the critical issues. So technology is at least as much about people as it is actually about the software and hardware itself. And I think that that's a critical aspect if we're going to get the most out of the data. For the benefit of all of us, then we need really skilled people.
And Wal made that point actually in the private board this morning, just going around for comments. So Wal, then Amanda, Wal, Stephen.
Yeah. Well, you first.
Yeah, I was definitely first.
I'm just working right to left. It's not a.
It's a quick one, actually. Sorry, no, it's just it's
Well, she's
just
chief exec.
because of where I'm sitting. Well, it's just picking up on Mark's point actually a little bit, which is if you are a regular user of the app, every single time you turn it on, there's new functionality, and actually that is just fantastic. I mean, you and I have talked before, for example, about proxy login and the ability to do it for children or older parents, whatever. And actually, I've just turned mine on, and it's offering me the opportunity to do that. So, it is just fantastic. What about those people who are not regular users? Because I think it's a collective challenge. But given it is changing so quickly, I'm conscious that despite the fact that we've got huge amounts of activity now going through the app, there's still a bit of a risk that that's some of the same people reusing. And actually, perhaps for those people who don't have repeat prescriptions regularly or aren't having regular blood tests, they will not be aware of all the functionality that currently exists. So I recognise that's a collective challenge, but I'd just be really interested in your thoughts on how we can help encourage people who maybe aren't traditional or current users to go back and see what more is now available.
So hold. I'm doing the same trick because otherwise we never manage to the time. I'm heading to Wal and Steve, but as I've got the mic, I think it is. You heard me at the start. I think it's brilliant, but I would also say I think it is still a bit clunky, and I would also say that I'm not sure that the headline stats are always reflective of the experience on the ground. So Wal and I just opened the NHS app, sitting next to each other here. Mine worked, and Wal's said not available. And so actually, what we need in the app, we need to keep on driving its extended functionality, but we also need to make sure that the resilience and reach and availability are fully operational. Because actually, nothing will turn off people faster than actually if it suddenly starts not to work. So on the clunkiness point, it's the point I made when we met a couple of weeks ago. I went back to it. I'd like to volunteer to take part in cancer research. And I can't do it. Well, I could do it, but actually it takes me to a page and it says, do you want to do it? And then I can't say yes to cancer research. It lists about 200 cancers and says, which of these do you want to enter research for? At which point, to be honest, I just say, oh, I'm not going to bother because I don't know. Then I don't even recognise what some of them are, actually, because I'm not suitably educated. So there is something about clunkiness which we must be very open with each other, but it's a brilliant innovation. The other one, lastly, is, and it's probably the wrong philosophy, but is it open architecture? And would we ever consider opening it to not commercial, but developers who will put other activities on it that would drive foot flow to actually get ever more engagement with it, and then allow us actually to put more nudge behaviour and more capability on it. But would we ever have open architecture rather than our own teams designing the new idea of functionality and adding it? And that may be a really stupid idea, of course, but I just ask it.
both things I was going to ask, but thank you. Never mind. I'll come at it slightly differently. So one of the things is that, and the reasons why it didn't work was, one, Richard could get his medical records, I couldn't, and that's the surgery. Yeah. So it's patchy. So the experience, the headline is great, but actually the experience is different depending on what your surgeons decide to allow you to do. They told me I can't access medical records. They checked up, blah, 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 sometime actually in 2024, which we're now in. The second thing is, please take this in the nicest way, it was a great presentation. I'm a huge believer in the app. But one of the reasons it's clunky is because it's not native on your phone. Right? And actually, we all, it's a markedly different experience when you have a app that's native on your phone, because you do so much more with it. So you can customize what you see with your cancer stuff, link to your records, in a way we can't. Because which basically, you're basically linking to a page, not quite as bad as that, but nearly. And that's not great. And so my question is, you've given us the sort of the benefits and the vision. Tell me about the chassis. Tell me about what needs to be built to get there, because the danger is we'll overexcite people, and native apps, scalability, security, ability to add stuff won't happen in the way we expect.
Very good. So the last question coming at you is from
Well,
Steve.
you've just asked. So the question was going to be, it's just a front to a web page at the moment, isn't it? When's it going to be a full functioning app? Because that will give a lot of functionality that will avoid the clunkiness.
I didn't realise that's what I'd asked. Actually.
That is what you asked.
That is what you asked. Actually, you came at it slightly differently.
That's the technical way of asking it.
Thank you very much. So Joe, Helen, Vin, I don't know how you want to divide those up and have a go.
Like on being university challenged, we've got an order which will answer these. So the first thing is, I think, digital workforce. So we will shortly be publishing a digital workforce plan for the NHS. Bob Wachter did a review of the country's digital readiness several years ago now, and he returned back to the UK late last year, and in fact commented on how much progress we'd made with things like the Digital Academy, but also commented on how much more we will do. So we will be publishing a digital workforce plan in the first half of this year. The second part then, with regard to signing up to research, the Be Part of Research is not NHS England's webpage. It is run by the National Institute of Health Research. We've taken the feedback that you've given us, Chair, and others have given us about the clunkiness by which you can sign on to research, and I'm meeting Lucy Chappell, the Chief Exec of NHR and the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Department of Health shortly to discuss how we can improve that user experience for them. And in terms of the access to the medical record, so in order to get full access to your medical record, you have to ask your GP to give you access to the medical record. Around 85% of the GPs in the country have done that, and we continue to work with the remaining 15% to make it possible for them to do that. They have some understandable concerns, particularly around safeguarding, to make sure it is safe access to the record, but obviously we are continuing to increase that number while we work with them on a practice-by-practice basis. Just on the question of the app, I mean, we are in the transformation to absolutely determined to back the developments in the app. I think many of the comments that colleagues have made around the table relate to how we can improve it even more than it is at the moment, but it's no doubt that it is transforming the relationship with the citizen.
Definitely.
So Joe and Helen, I'll hand over to you.
I suppose briefly, just a sense of scale, really. We spend about a third on the NHS app as we do in my hospital, which is just gives you a sense of where we're at sort of investment wise, and it's where I think we're going is when we ask the NHS, we know we can always spend more money, and there's a bit of selling the vision is part of how we take the NHS on this journey with us, as well as our citizens are there already. Our citizens are the one that absolutely want it. And we're sort of at that place at the moment of how do we engage with every organisation, whether it's GP practice to switch the record on, whether it's the acute hospital to put the Wi-Fi, whatever it is. At the moment, if you ask the NHS, there's a bit of, we want a faster horse. And actually, this is the car, and the question about the chassis is completely spot on. And I'll hand you over to Helen, because we're not going for a Ferrari. We actually want something that everybody can use. So, Helen.
I think the chassis question was the one I asked without realising. I just thought,
no, that wasn't yours.
It wasn't mine. Okay. Helen.
Well, actually, I was just going to say, in answer to the question about how do we move to a native environment and get a lot of the smart functions that you see with other applications on your phone today. So I suppose I've got good news on that in terms of we are currently developing that, and we're hoping in the next month or two to actually put that native code transition in place. And then from there, once you've put that base layer in, or a chassis, if you like, we will then be building on that the kind of features that you're used to seeing on a mobile application. So I think that was the first question. There is a lot of work under the hood of the app, and it is, I don't want to say uniquely complex, because other people have very complex technical environments, but I think everybody knows that we've got a very fragmented technical landscape in the NHS, and the complexity of all of the integrations we need to do to move forward. So in terms of that question about open architecture and how does it make sense or not to integrate is a really big trade-off call. It's a bit like the feedback about be part of research being clunky. A lot of our integrations are handoffs to, a third-party kind of web environment, and therefore we've got control of a kind of certain part of the experience, but not the full end-to-end. And I think we have to be really mindful, given we want to give the very best possible patient experience, empower people to self-serve and do things through the app, about how much we control and develop ourselves, because it is a very unique proposition as the NHS, and I think we really want to leverage that as much as possible.
So I would finish up by saying we've seen unbelievable progress in the last 12 months.
Amazing.
And the reality of where we're going with this, and the appetite of our citizens to get on board and engage with it, is voracious. And we need to make sure that we, in every aspect of the NHS family, we are playing our part, as I say, whether it's the GP, whether it's the mental health services, supporting them, pharmacy, and just getting the NHS, the health and care system, because don't forget social care, because we have to get that connected in the same way in order that we can provide that full data set for our citizens.
Very good. So,
one final comment, Chair, just to finish up. I'll literally be 2 sentences, if that's okay. So just saying, this week we've launched a campaign through social media, broadcast media and others to encourage the remaining members of the population who've not downloaded the app to do so. It's got the catchy phrase, tap the app. As I said,
did you make that up?
If it wasn't you, no, Chris did. If it were, so yeah, I'm not taking credit for that. But we encourage people, I think, both through this public board and through other means to use the app and make sure, because it'll only get better and better.
So look, I think we could go for a long time on the potential here, and so it's been a very good. It's a glimpse, only because of the time afforded to you, to what I think Amanda said, I've said, colleagues have said is. And you've reflected back to us, and I completely agree, is utterly transformational. And to think that 5, 6, 7 years ago, the NHS continues to evolve all the time, continues to innovate and change. And I think this NHS app, increasing its functionality, increasing its interoperability with the way people behave, it will be remarkable. So thank you for all your leadership in the space, actually. Very good. So we're going to get to the last item on the agenda, and Claire, I think it's you and John, but I think John's going to lead off, is he? And again, it's a really good paper setting out quite an interesting set of potential challenges, but also opportunities for us. So it's Dementia Programme and Alzheimer's Disease Modifying Treatments.
Thank you, Chair. I will try and be concise, being the last item, but I won't rush, because this is so important for so many patients and families. And actually, when we come on and talk about the potential new treatments, the financial implications for the NHS are also very significant potentially. So the paper is really divided up into 2 sections. The first part provides an update on the wider dementia programme, with a specific focus on progress to improve rates of dementia diagnosis, and the second part then focuses in really on NHS preparations for potential new disease-modifying treatments for Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common cause of dementia, so representing up to 2/3 of all dementia cases. For context, rates of dementia, including those caused by Alzheimer's, are growing and are once again actually the leading cause of death after having very briefly been overtaken by coronavirus. But dementia is now the leading cause of death. A diagnosis of dementia, we know, is devastating for individuals and their families, and the impact on society and the economy more broadly is huge. In terms of the impact on the NHS, and this is set out right at paragraph 1, we know that 25% of acute beds are occupied by people with dementia. Their length of stay is on average twice as long as other people aged over 65 without dementia. 90% of people with dementia found admission to hospital frightening and confusing. 43% of those admitted to hospital with dementia were admitted due to a UTI or chest infection. And over a 1-year period, 25% of people with dementia living in their own homes were admitted to hospital with a potentially treatable condition at home. So a timely diagnosis of dementia is critical, and it enables people to access advice, information, care and support to live well and reduce their chances of needing hospital admission. And that is why, actually back in 2015, we set a national ambition for at least 2/3 of people with dementia having a formal diagnosis. So that's a target of 66.7%. And just prior to the pandemic, the dementia diagnosis rate had been tracking above this ambition, but we did lose ground during the pandemic as the numbers of people coming forward into primary care with symptoms dropped off significantly. Our focus on recovery has meant we are now seeing consistent but sustained improvements in the diagnosis rate, and the December data from 23 shows that we are now at 64.6%, so just under the target we set. But we have also seen a 17% increase in referrals into memory assessment services between April to December 23 compared to the previous period in the previous year. And we are pretty clear that with growing awareness and, in fact, media reporting of potential new disease-modifying treatments, which I will come on to next, we expect referrals to continue to increase further, supported by a range of activities set out in the paper at paragraphs 8 to 16, which I will assume people have read. So if I turn now to the new treatments for Alzheimer's, the first thing to say is current treatments for the disease are largely focused on helping with dementia symptoms, but they don't alter the decline in cognition, language or problem solving. But there is an exciting pipeline of new treatments that are now showing promise in actually modifying the different elements of the disease process. So our horizon scanning, and some of this is set out at Annex A, shows that there are 28 disease-modifying treatments in late-stage trials. And the first 2 of these, lecanemab and donanemab, are currently applying for UK marketing authorisations. NICE technology appraisals are also now running in parallel with that licensing process to minimise delays in reaching decisions around the clinical and cost effectiveness of these treatments, should those licensing decisions be positive. And there are a number of different recommendations that actually could be made by NICE, which include recommended for routine use, not recommended for routine use, recommended for managed access, and finally, and this is rarely actually used, a recommendation for use only in research. And it's worth actually just saying that under a routine commissioning recommendation, NHS commissioners, and this is principally ICBs, but does include NHS England as the commissioner of PET-CT capacity and the genomic testing that is associated with this pathway. But those commissioners are under a legal requirement to make funding available for the entire eligible patient population within 90 days of NICE final guidance being issued, unless a funding variation is agreed by NICE. So I think that's quite an important point for the board to recognise. Nevertheless, whilst these 2 treatments are rightly considered breakthrough medicines, creating significant hope, I think, for the future, their benefit is actually relatively modest. They will not stop people with Alzheimer's disease from continuing to decline, and they do not offer a cure. Additionally, they come with the potential risk of brain bleeds or swelling, known as ARIA, and the treatment regime, which requires fortnightly infusions in the case of lecanemab and 4-weekly infusions in the case of donanemab, will clearly be very intensive for patients and their families. So the programme we've set up to prepare the NHS for implementing these treatments, should they be licensed and approved by NICE, is really having to deal with considerable number of uncertainties, and we are planning at the moment and modelling for a range of possible scenarios, and absolutely with an eye on potential future treatments and diagnostic tests which we know are on the horizon, including things like the blood-based biomarkers. So just to emphasise some of these uncertainties, nobody yet knows whether UK licences will be granted by the MHRA for these first treatments. We are working very closely with NICE, but it is for the NICE independent kind of committee process to meet to reach conclusions and recommendations on the use of these treatments. We don't yet know actually how many of the estimated 1.6 million people with mild cognitive impairment may present in primary care for further assessment. Furthermore, we don't know how many patients may actually be eligible for treatment, but we know from NICE that they have estimated that this could be between 50,000 and 280,000, so quite a big range at present. And finally, and this is important, we don't actually yet know how many of the eligible patient population may choose to take up the treatment, given the relatively modest clinical benefits, the safety profile associated with these medicines, and the intensive nature of the treatment regime. But despite all of those uncertainties, I think hopefully board members will see from the diagram in Annex B that we really do have a very good understanding of the patient pathway for these first treatments and where we would need to expand existing capacity and put in place new services in order to make these treatments available. Last few comments. The potential costs under a full rollout scenario are currently estimated at between 500 million and £1 billion per year, and will need to be carefully considered as part of the next spending review. These figures include both the drug costs and the service implementation costs, and should be treated with a degree of caution because they are in part based on US drug pricing information that's in the public domain. But companies will, of course, be able to offer confidential discounts as part of the standard NICE process and potentially enter into commercial negotiations with NHS England to further support their value proposition to NICE. So, in summary, I think we are at an exciting point with some potential new medicines to roll out on the NHS and a significant number in the pipeline. But implementation will absolutely need to be dependent on MHRA licensing decisions and recommendations from NICE. The potential budget impact is very significant and will need to be considered in the context of the spending review. Provision of accurate and accessible information for the public will also be key, including on the potential benefits and risks of treatment. There will need to be a particular focus on developing the workforce of experts in cognitive assessment, including potential digital options, diagnosis and treatment administration. The diagnostic pathways, including the use of MRI and safety monitoring, is significant, including standing up genetic tests, a new type of PET-CT scanning, and additional lumbar puncture support. So we will...
I think you've given us quite an expansive description of the...
That's a brief summary, Chair, and I will stop there and see if people have any questions.
I'm sure there are. So Mark, I know, wants to go, and David wants...
As a question. So firstly, I thought it was a very good balanced paper. It has been an enormous journey to get anything that has any significant effect, and I think you rightly said that this is probably the sort of first generation, if that. And it's worth also remembering that there are other treatments that affect the progression of Alzheimer's disease. For example, the treatment of comorbidities such as diabetes, hypertension, and other causes of sort of vascular disease. So one shouldn't forget that, because you can make a difference using existing approaches. But as I say, these antibodies do show some effect, but they're not the magic bullet that everyone would like, I think.
Thank you. That's David?
Yeah, it's ever, John, very clear, so thank you, and thanks for the explanation as well. Am I right in understanding, though, that in order to get access to this medication, if it was approved, there needs to be a diagnosis by a clinician that somebody is experiencing dementia? And given that diagnosis rates are around 60+%, there is a stretch. That, in my mind, means you've got to get your diagnosis rates up to 100%. Have I missed the point? It's more than likely that I have at this time. But
so these treatments are. Oh, sorry, Chair.
I'm going to, if you can make a note of the questions. Yeah. So Simon and then Vin, if that's right.
I think it's quite a difficult situation, actually, because the results, as you say, may even be less than a minimally clinically important difference. The data isn't that robust. It's obviously excited a lot of people because it's a difficult area and we've been struggling for some time. And the side effects are not trivial at all. And the way in which it has to be given is also not trivial. So, in answer to your comment, David, it may be an awful lot of people don't want this, actually, because it's got some lethal side effects, as we know. And the other thing is, it's the first two. I didn't realise there were 28 coming. I thought there were a dozen. And it's very tempting to leap in when the first two arrive. And during COVID, when realising that this was going to happen, a similar situation, they set up what we call a platform trial, which you have one very good control group and you can keep adding against that control. And it worked very successfully. And this seems to really be calling out for a similar approach, because we know there's going to be lots of other drugs coming which may be worse. Well, it's unlikely, but they may be better or just the same. And we also have very little long-term data, so we don't know. It seems unlikely that it's going to actually lead to a lasting clinical improvement.
Thank you. You may comment on that, probably might want to comment on that in a moment, but Vin?
Yeah, so two comments, Chair. So firstly, I just wanted to make sure we don't lose the significant amount of work we're doing in the NHS to get the basics right for people with dementia. So people in hospital, general practices have training as dementia-friendly friends. There are some fantastic examples of dementia-friendly wards in some of our new hospital buildings, and there are really good partnerships. I'm sure Tracy's got some at local level with local government and partnerships, so that actually the whole of the environment in the community is supportive of people that are unfortunate to have dementia. Second point I just wanted to make was on the new treatments. This is something that is of huge interest to the life sciences industry and to the Life Sciences Council. It's one of the Life Sciences mission. I sit on the Life Sciences Delivery Board. And one of the things I think that John's illustrated is that, firstly, I'm a strong believer in the phrase make haste slowly. And one of the most important things we should do with this is, I think John's demonstrated, we are doing a huge amount of planning for what potential future with these new exciting drugs might hold. But we must not also rush into things. It's really important we spend the time developing this so actually we end up delivering a really effective service for patients and really good delivery of these new drugs when they come on the market.
Thank you. And then there's one more comment, and then I'll let you respond.
Well, I was going to really comment on Simon, because I think you've illustrated why John made this point, that we must wait for the MHRA and processes, and we're not getting ahead of ourselves in that sense. There is a set of processes to go through in terms of regulation and clinical and cost effectiveness. But I think the important thing is seeing the pipeline potentially coming, that we do the preliminary work and we don't wait for NICE and MHRA. We get ahead in terms of our thinking around this, and that's exactly what John and the team are doing. There is clearly the possibility. Obviously, there will be more trials in these areas, and the pharma companies will do them. There's always the opportunity to either encourage trials through NIHR or to do pilots in terms of the way we introduce these. We're doing that, for instance, in the obesity drugs, which is another area which potentially could have a lot of cost implications to the NHS, but clearly could have benefit as well. And I think part of the reason for doing this with dementia, it's not the only area in which we're going to see this sort of issue, and I think getting ahead and working on a sort of standardised approach to how we think ahead is as important as just the particular case around dementia.
I'm trying to get to the final point, but the finance director has just flagged that he wants to make a comment.
I was going to say, Simon's point about could you can you create something which feels closer to a platform trial, would be the ideal. Our processes don't entirely allow us to get there because of the way we assess and almost like, tick, yes, this drug has passed muster for commissioning. And I think one of the challenges really should be thinking about with the department, with NICE, with NIHR is honestly within our processes, how can we, for something like this, create something like a platform trial?
Good idea.
Because if, things are coming down the line, you also want to think, how is it cost effective, one treatment versus another different, you actually want to look at in the round, and our processes don't really allow us to get at that. It's one of the things we have discussed, but at the moment we can't quite see our way to get there, but that would be the ideal.
Mark?
Well, I think you asked a really key question, Julian, because it seems to me that we are moving to a world where we have such powerful data that you can have phase 4 studies, in other words, studies in the real world, which should probably go on for most new drugs that are introduced, actually, because it's only when you use it at scale that you suddenly start discovering not only the benefits in a much wider population, but also potential side effects that weren't recognised in relatively small trials. So, there is the opportunity to change the whole enormously expensive process for developing and evaluating new drugs.
So that, I think, is
important for something like this.
I think that's a topic we should take away and have a think about and have a conversation about. And obviously, there's a series of other partners if that were to emerge, or we were to seek to cause that to emerge. So, John, final comments on any of those comments or questions?
There are a lot of comments there. Rather than necessarily questions, a couple of reflections. On the point about the platform trial, I think that is really important, and that is something a discussion we've been having with colleagues in the department, with NICE and so on. And I think it is not the case that a kind of NICE technology appraisal process, completely excludes the possibility of that, and I think that's something as a system we need to continue to discuss and look at options for doing that. But nevertheless, we do need to tackle the first treatments that are coming through this process. We have a responsibility for doing that, but we are doing that very much with a view of the pipeline of 28 on the horizon, some of which are very different modes of delivery, tablet forms. We don't know yet what the license requirements will be. So I think it's important that we do tackle the first coming through, but in the context of a kind of broader strategy, including kind of commercial strategy in the future. I think on David's point about diagnosis rates, yes, we will need to clearly increase the clinical diagnosis rates, and the licenses for these first treatments, I think, will almost certainly require also a kind of confirmatory diagnosis of amyloid within via PET-CT and lumbar puncture, hence the need to expand that capacity. So we're absolutely thinking about those requirements, but we also suspect that as new treatments that actually can begin to modify the disease, and I think we've already started seeing that. I think more and more patients and people are going to be more willing and prepared to come forward to have those kind of assessments, where currently there is a kind of limited range of treatment options. So I think the new treatments will drive up the diagnosis rate.
Thank you. Look, I think it was a really good paper, and it was a good conversation to have, actually. It's shown, I think, the complexity of some of these judgments. And these judgments are made outside us, of course. What I take huge confidence from, actually, and optimism is it's the optimism around what you're indicating about pipeline of potential medical treatments here, plus the fact that the NHS is already doing planning, thinking about capacity and getting ready. And then that last conversation with Mark and Steve and Julian about is a different way to get to a sort of a platform approach is something we should really pick up and take up with our partner colleagues. And then I'm going to finish with one last comment, which is you did give the stats, and I bang on about the stats away from the dementia point and possible treatments. It's this use of our infrastructure capacity, and it's that combination of statistics, which is that 25% of acute hospital beds, 1 in 4 hospital beds, are occupied by people with dementia, and 44% of those people are in because of a UTI and chest infection. Now, it may not be 100% of that 44%, I can see the numbers are going to get away from me, 100% of the 44% may still have to be in, but if they're in because of a UTI and chest infection, they don't need to be. And we run our acute hospitals at 94, 95% capacity all through the summer. Imagine if we could just get and avoid the admission, the unnecessary admission of half of the people who are in with a UTI chest infection who have dementia. And of course, they are in for, we also know, for longer periods, partly because of age and partly because of the nature of the condition. I think it's a really interesting insight into actually how our capacity, our acute capacity, is actually being utilised. And focusing on that, I think, might create more capacity faster than our ability to build more physical capacity or more beds. But anyway, it's a really good paper, good conversation. So let's bring the board to a close. I'm just going to quickly look around the board. If anyone's got any other business, speak now, raise your hands. Otherwise, thank you very much. We've been going actually 8 hours now with the two boards, and you've only had less than 20 minutes of break. So thank you for your commitment and continued enthusiasm, but it's been a really good discussion, both boards. Thank you very much. Thank you.